welcome back to the Awakening Philosophy podcast. My name is Jed, and we are reading the Phaedo, and we are discovering whether or not we have a soul that is immortal, and what are the arguments to show us that we indeed do have an immortal soul. We're listening to Socrates' arguments, following them ourselves, but also understanding them as he gives them, so that we can understand more about the logos that he's using and the dialectic that he's using in his conversation, in the way he structures the logos, in order to benefit his friends and benefit us. Last time, he provided a few arguments that seemed to convince Simmias, one of the two dudes there in the prison cell with Socrates on his last day. And then they asked, well, hang on a second, what about convinced Tweedledee, but what about Tweedledum here? What about Cebes? Is he convinced that we have an immortal soul? And are we convinced that we have an immortal soul? So what we're going to be doing today is going over those arguments, really nailing them down, making it ours. Why? Because philosophy is for our development of our own state of mind. It's a consciousness development activity. It's a mystic tradition, as Socrates informs us in his doctrine right before this argument. So we want to have the logos make the logos our own. It is, of course, the self logos, so it is ours. We are, according to what we read yesterday, remembering it. We are remembering the self logos. In fact, the fact that this argument can be persuaded tells us something about the immortality of the soul. If we can recognize something of the self-logos after hearing it for the first time in this life, what is it that we're recognizing? Why can we say that this argument is true? Why can we say that we've been convinced? What about that argument do we recognize? And also, as we've been seeing from the comments from people joining me in the stream, thank you for joining me, by the way. We've been getting questions like, how come I love this? Why was I inspired when I came across the logos? Why was I inspired when I came across the work of Dr. Pierre Grimes or Mindy Mandal's All About Platonism YouTube series? Why me and not my friends? And why, if hearing it for the first time, did I feel a kinship with it? And I feel excited about it? And why do I listen to these talks even when I'm enjoying my day, doing other activities? Why do I like to ponder and read along with this podcast as we go? Good questions. Well, we have that, along with what about Simmias? What did Simmias say? He recognized the self-beauty and the self-necessity in the logos he was hearing. Not only the logos, but some qualities that pertain to being. Because we've been learning that if philosophy is a mystic tradition, it's about experiencing with our state of mind, our consciousness, the realm of being. And the way of understanding that realm of being gives us the self-ideas, the word that is mistranslated, unfortunately, tragically, as forms, if you learn it in a lot of mainstream schools. And we've been talking about the reason why, because of the counterattack to our golden age, to philosophy, the Aristotelian or reductionism tradition, materialism, a way of getting rid of the mind. We've been recognizing that not only does that happen in culture, it's a part of the human, the reason it's there, it served a human evolutionary purpose, and it's part of why we are here ourselves personally. Our pathologos, or our false logos, that causes us to have different ideas about the soul and our life and why we're here and the self. That itself, lost my train of thought there for a second. Right, we are here to address that as well as develop our logos. So let's go back and talk about the fact that, the realm of being. Self-being is something that we can recognize in the logos, and Simmias himself recognized, hey, there's something beautiful about your reasoning, but also I followed the logical necessity. There was a self-necessity in the arguments that followed that I was able to recognize. And in the argument that preceded, we talked about the fact that, well, you've never seen beauty or necessity necessity he wasn't made explicit, but any of the idea cells. Oh, that's right. I was talking about the counterattack. Sorry, let's go back a second. That's my comical rewind sound. Forms. Right, the counterattack. We recognize in ourselves that our anti-logos arises as we approach truth, as we approach our most meaningful goals, as we develop in the logos towards our destiny. We trigger our counterattacks. The things which Parmenides told us to become aware of as we progress, because as a result from caused by our upbringing in the human species, we do necessarily develop false beliefs about ourselves and the world. And we talked about how that served a purpose in the evolution of humanity, but we still have to address it ourselves. That's part of the purification and perfection process that we're here to do. Something about being human forces us to have to address a false belief about the self and reality. We have to. It's not personal, it's human. The question is, do we have the virtues enough to do that? To challenge our false images of what's true and beautiful? To challenge what's comfortable and familiar in our prejudices, which are taught to us at a very young age and a result of our family, our culture, our time period, the society in which we grew up. And of course, has that evolutionary function that served its purpose in the early stages of human evolution to keep us from exploring out of the cave and blindly following the leader of the cave above all else, which of course, like all problems, are a kind of solution that no longer serves its purpose. It's a solution that no longer works. So we're not blaming ourselves. We don't say we are originally sinful or we are evil by nature. Quite the opposite. There is a self-necessity and a kind of self-beauty in the logos, including in our pathologos, in our problems that arise. So, too, while we say, well, there's a great tragedy being done that we have not translated the ideas as idea, as intellectual distinctions made of the beholding in our consciousness of the truth of reality, the realm of being that is eternal and immortal. Hey, it's not evil that it has been mistranslated as form or concept, and therefore we've missed the entire essence of philosophy for 1,000 years. It has a necessity. It is understandable. There's a rational, understandable system behind why. The same counterattack. As we encounter truth, there's a counterattack, both within ourselves and within our culture. So we can just understand the mistranslation, the betrayals of philosophy as the cultural counterattack, the human counterattack. The same principles played out through the drama, through the narrative, through the mythology of human life, the human evolutionary story. All right. But there is also a necessity, a self-necessity for us to address that, purify ourselves from that mistaken education, from that ignorance. So there is a necessity both for ourselves, if we want to overcome our problems and reach our highest goals, escape our fate and reach our destiny, but also for mankind. There is a necessity for us to awaken philosophy right now. We are running out of time. We are hurting ourselves. We are fighting. We are engaged in civil discord and battles and war, and which are the three terms Socrates used to say this is what follows if you don't do philosophy. If you don't love wisdom, if you don't love learning, and ultimately if you don't have a love for pure phronesis, self-phronesis. If you don't do this, you'll be directing your phronesis, whatever that is, to the body. You'll be a lover of soggy tomatoes. You'll be a lover of the body, philosomatos. And then that manifests as one or both of a lover of fame and honor, or a lover of riches and possessions, which we see playing out right now in real time. Thus, the necessity for us to reawaken and share philosophy. While he said it was a mystic tradition with its mystic initiation rituals, and he said anyone who's not a pure philosopher doing philosophy in the right way is not the true mystic. They are just a staff bearer, giving us that fantastic expression. Many are the staff bearers, few are the inspired mystics, and those are, I consider those the ones who practice true philosophy correctly. So we want to become true mystics, true philosophers, which is the human quest, because we're leveling up. But we're not leveling up our possessions. We're not all becoming famous. It doesn't work that way. Why? Because possessions need to be shared. It's not to be hoarded, right? For one person to be rich, you need everybody else to be poor. It's a competitive game. It's a relative game. If everyone has $1, no one's rich. But if someone has $10 and everyone has 1 cent, then they are the rich person. That's what we have to understand about capitalism and about the money system. It's inherently competitive, exclusionary, right? It's hoarding personal resources because of a love of a body. And we need to trace that ignorance. We don't want to vilify people who are in this game, because that's the game. Capitalism rewards that, right? And we seek honor. So people who like to be respected and well liked, that's not a bad thing, so long as it's mixed with logos directed to being, dianoia and nous, understanding and knowledge. That's what makes it from a vice into a virtue. So we're not inherently bad. We have the systems that direct us towards the philosophical quest, only we have usurpers to the throne in the place of things that actually should be there. Instead of chasing true excellence, we chase the image of it. Instead of loving phronesis, we love the body. Instead of loving philosophy, we instead of respecting and loving, honoring people who progress well in philosophy, develop their logos, develop their dialectic, and can therefore help people in the truest possible way, we honor other sorts of people. So honoring people who do well isn't bad, but so long as we recognize it's philosophy we should be honoring. It's philosophy we should be pursuing. It's philosophy that should be ruling. Why? Same thing as anything else. Understanding and knowledge. If you want to fly a plane, you get pilots who have understanding of how to fly a plane and experience. So too, if you want the good and you want to be ruled towards the good and you want to benefit souls, you need somebody who has an understanding and knowledge of the nature of soul and the good, but also the nature of how to bring people to the good. That's the dialectic, and that's what we're learning ourselves. So we are being the change we want to see in the world, to borrow an expression that's commonly used. We ourselves are learning what the soul is, learning what the self is, learning the dialectic, and you know what? It's a lot of fun. It's the funnest game in town. It's the best game in town. Some say the onlyest game in town. Onlyest? The noblest game in town. So it's a lot of fun, and I'm really appreciative to those who have been sharing in this quest with me, live on Twitch and following along on the YouTube channel. And part of that is understanding what the soul is. That's a big part of it. If we're to benefit the soul and also share an understanding that we can benefit all souls, hey, the nature of the exclusionary capitalism as a result of hoarding riches or hoarding fame at the expense of other people can be replaced with something cooperative and inclusive. What's the most cooperative? The dialectic. It's literally the opposite of argument. It's the opposite of fighting. It's even the opposite of debate. There's no winners and losers. You both go together. You use your art to bring people along. And instead of riches, what's something inclusive? The self. In fact, it's the most inclusive because everyone is of the self. Everyone has the self. Doesn't matter what color they are, where they were born, how tall they are, how short they are. Doesn't matter. They're all the self. So if we want to bestow honors, why not bestow honors for people who perfect and purify themselves in the logos towards the self. Why not celebrate that? And also, these people, their success benefits us. It overflows. Unlike capitalism, that you can only be rich if you have poor people. That's a terrible, disgusting situation we're in at our point of history. These terrible people working in places of authority and leadership where they're only benefiting their own selves financially without realizing that the game itself is inherently competitive. For every hour you work, if you're earning less money than your boss, then you are making the discrepancy between you and your boss bigger. So while it seems like you're earning more money, we are getting poorer. And we're noticing that over time, we're not getting richer as a species, we're getting poorer. Why? Because we allow some people to get rich. We allow some people to become billionaires, to become dragons, sitting on top of their pile of gold, without realizing that that only has worth relative to the failure of others. That's the nature of competition. That's the nature of debate. That's the nature of war. Your success is dependent on the failure of others. That's what follows, according to the dialectic that we've been doing on Socrates' doctrine, that necessarily has a self-necessity that follows in a kind of beautiful way, that follows if philosophy doesn't exist. If instead of philosophy that exists in the realm of being and of the self, we have opinions and beliefs instead of understanding and knowledge. Why? Well, whose belief is the right one, the most common one, or the belief of those in power? So we have expressions in our culture, who's to say? Which is a question about authority. Who? We want to say, what's to say that this is true? What? What questions? That can be shared in, not a who question. Who's to say what's right and wrong? It's not a who. That's about a person. What is to say? What is the logos? What is the logos that outlines what is true for us, for humanity, and for our species right now? What's to say? And we know it's the logos. That's why we're in this game. To benefit ourselves and benefit the world, benefit humanity, but ourselves first. Because we want to know the nature of the soul, the self, reality, the good, and the dialectic first, so that we can come back and help others. And of course, we're all learning together. That's the fun thing. Philosophy is not a one-person game. It's a two-person or many-person game. So, if that's all the case, we want to be certain for ourselves that the soul exists. And part of our education doesn't involve that. If it's physical, then we often told, oh yeah, your soul is just one of the ideas is, oh, your soul is just like your breath. It scatters to the wind when your body dies. If you have that idea, or if you recognize that as part of your own mythology or a particular mythology in humankind, then you could use those arguments we just went through to counter them. And that's why we're going to go back and nail them down, make it our own, so we can use it, not just with others, but for ourselves. When we feel like there's nothing important in our world, when we're in those lower states of consciousness, those states of feelings, think that there's nothing meaningful, there's nothing beyond this existence. There's so much apparent injustice in our physical world, then what's the point of it all if we're just going to die and our soul scatters to the wind? Well, then you need to engage with yourself in this kind of dialectic, or with your friend in this kind of dialectic, the one that Socrates just went through. So that's why we're going to make it ours. That's why we're going to take some time out of our day to nail it down and make it ours, so we can recognize it, so we can get familiar with it, so we can make it ours, so we can see through it. That's the nature of leveling up. We've been talking about how if this is the archetype of the hero's journey, then all of the other aspects of that hero's journey, like leveling up, like improving on a skill, applies to the logos as the ideal, as the actual, as the anagogic, or the highest expression within the analogy. Lesser to greater to ultimate, or equal. We've got a new word for ultimate, equal, lesser, greater, and equal. Equal to what? Equal to the ultimate, equal to the whole, equal to the greatest. So we're pushing that anagogic movement through the analogy to the equal. And Socrates says, hey, even sticks seek that equalness. So we want to seek it too. Right? What is the equal, or the equal to what? Equal to reality? Equal to the self? What is that kind of equal expression of developing your skill set? Well, hey, this one. The skill set of the dialectic about why the soul must be immortal. Not because I said so or because Socrates said so, but because we recognize in it a self-necessity and a self-beauty in the self-logos. There's something about it that makes sense, logically necessary, and also beautiful in a certain kind of way. Which, ironically, is the argument itself. Socrates is saying, hey, if you've never seen beauty or necessity in the physical world with your physical senses, then where did you learn it? How can you recognize that? It's so important. You need it to recognize what's most important about our soul, that it's necessarily immortal, but then where did you learn it? If you didn't learn it with your senses, then it can't have been while you were here. Simmias throws out the idea, what about right when we're born? Well, that means that you learned it and you lost it straight away at the same time. So if being is the paradigm for beauty, necessity, truth, and the self-logos, where do we learn it such that we can, as Socrates said, even have this conversation? Must have been before we're born. Otherwise, hey, having it not only is knowing it, but to be able to give a logos of it. That which you know, you are necessarily able to explain. And he says, hey, have you ever met anybody who can do it? I fear that when you're dead, Socrates, there'll be no one left who has the knowledge of being, beauty, justice, goodness, and can necessarily give a logos of it. Interesting arguments, convincing arguments maybe, but let's nail them down. Maybe the more familiar we get with them, the more convincing they'll be for us, which can lead us into the rest of the dialogue. Well, if the soul is necessarily immortal, what does that say about our past mythologies that says otherwise? And then what can we say about how what we're here for? One of the big questions, if the soul is immortal, that's necessarily something helpful in understanding what the heck we're supposed to be doing while we're here. You can't just be being a dragon, accumulating physical wealth, or building statues in your honor. There has to be something significant about where we're going that informs us about what we're supposed to be doing while we're here. Lots of fun. What do you say, Owen?
Wow. Wow.
Yeah, wow.
Wow.
So, on that note, let's jump in and nail down these arguments. We read a lot last time, so we're going back a bit. Here we are. Here's where we left off in our notes. First argument, if we are here, the soul must have been somewhere. That has to be the dead. If we're alive, we had to come from somewhere. Then it necessarily can't be the alive. Therefore, the soul exists while dead. Convincing? How about this? How about the second argument? The analogy of death to sleep. Being alive is to being dead, the greater as being awake is to being asleep. Both for the activity in being, or the state, and the process. Let's add that in. State. And becoming the process. If not, all would have the same condition experience, but would all end up like the mythological Enderman who is asleep. I don't know much about the Enderman in pop culture, but if he is a sleepwalker or some sort of zombie maybe, then good. If souls are generated out of something other than that source, then everything would be used up. We'd use up our resources. So there has to be some sort of circular, cyclical resource of living and then dying and then returning to life. Therefore, number one, the cyclical process of returning to life exists. Otherwise, we'd use up all the resources. Or if it wasn't circular but a straight line, we would all end up in the same spot, all sleeping. And the living must come to be from the dead. Therefore, the souls of the dead do exist. That's where we left off. That was argument 2. So let's see what the next one is. Oh, and there's an interesting idea. The self-logos ideas come into existence from its opposite self-idea. That's generation. Moving between the opposites is the generation. Awake to asleep, alive to dead, lesser from greater, and lesser to greater. Growth and decay. Right, let's see what happens for number 3. Yoked pair. Where's our conclusion? Oh, also another argument. Nature would be lame if it couldn't restore the process of generation. Returning back to life. I should add that one in. One more argument within there. So far we've got we'd all end up asleep. We'd use up the resources if being alive didn't come from being dead. But if we recognize that we can see oh, here we are. So actually this is where we are. The process of restoration did not always come to be from its opposite, as if it was going around in a circle, it would be a straight line. Where's our idea of nature being lame? Oh, here we go. What's easier to see? The process of dying is clearer to see, but shall we not deliver the opposite? Dying process is easier to see, therefore nature would be lame, a lack of power or ability. If it could not deliver the opposite process. Restoration. Restore a process of generation. Lame if not able to deliver the opposite generative process. Deliver. Let's make some more room down here. Oops. deliver the opposite process of restoring a process of generation. Of restoring a process of generation. So what would follow if we can see death, but that's easy to see, but nature couldn't also do that opposite thing? Well, if everything is coming to and from opposites, coming into existence from its opposites, then nature would have a lameness. So these are the arguments. This is what would follow if the soul didn't exist. It would be lame. A wild philosopher approaches in the chat. Weapons, undedicated, clothing off, nudity on. Right, the ancient Greeks would strip off when going into battle, so it's good to know that people in the chat are all nude. That means they're good at philosophy. They're philosophical warriors. So, we'd all end up asleep if it was a straight line. If it came from something other than the dead world, we'd use up all the living resources. And also nature would be lame if it could do one, but not do the other. Okay, these are our three arguments. Let's do a little picture for each of them. Let's do it in green. We would end up asleep. It was a straight line. If it was coming from something other than the dead, run out. Out of resources. And it would be lame if it could do the process of dying, but not coming to life. These are the three primary arguments we've got so far. This is to do with the process of dying and coming to life. Make this a bit neater. Now, therefore, a conclusion, the secular process of returning to life must exist, opposite of this one. Living comes to be from the dead, opposite of this one. And the souls of the dead do exist in order for this stuff to happen. This one doesn't have its own direct conclusion, but it's a good argument nonetheless. So, number 3, let's jump in. What else is he saying? What other arguments can we use if we don't yet recognize that the soul that we have is immortal? Is it not the case that if there's a process of returning to life again, it would be self-generation of being restored from the dead of those that are living? Wait a minute. Yes. Living comes to be from the dead, no less than the dead from the living. Then this is the case that it certainly appears to be sufficient proof that the souls of the dead must necessarily exist somewhere from whence they come to be again. So yeah, this is this argument here. He said, hey, if this process of dying and coming to life is from somewhere, there has to be a place where it's from. So that's how this third Conclusion. The souls of the dead do exist, because that's where it's from. This one here. This one here. There's the 3 pictures. So 3 conclusions from our 3 arguments there. Oh, I didn't show you that. Sorry about that. Here we go. So we have this dying and coming to life is from somewhere. This is if it couldn't have both, it would be lame. Nature would be lame. But seeing as it comes, the process of dying and coming to life is from somewhere. Therefore, the souls of the dead do exist. That's the last argument. First argument, that everything would be, we'd all end up asleep. Oops. We'd all end up asleep is the straight line argument. Straight line. We'd all end up asleep. That's this one here. If souls generated of anything else, it would use up its resources. So that's this one. Oops. Out of resources for people. And finally, therefore, it's circular and not linear. It comes to be from the dead, otherwise it would run out of resources, and the souls of the dead have to exist because the process has to be from something. You're dying from being alive and you're coming to life from being dead. If we can see one, of course, we're dying from, and the argument is nature would be lame if it can't do the other. We don't want lame nature, the lame nature argument. Lame nature. Okay, great.
Wow.
Sufficient proof. The souls of the dead must necessarily exist somewhere, from whence they indeed come to be again. Cebes says, it appears to me that this must be the case from what we have agreed on. He can't see it, but he can follow the reasoning. See it in this way, O Cebes, since it appears to me that we did not agree unjustly, for the process of restoration did not always come to be from one opposite to the other, as if they were going round in a circle. Instead, generation would proceed in a straight line from one point to its exact opposite, and if it did not return back again to the opposite by making any return, do you realize that things would ultimately have the same shape? And they would have the same... Oh, okay. Right, this is... Okay, we've already gone through this. It would have the same shape and same experience, so we should add that. Yes, we have. Same condition and experience. And shape. And shape. That's the Enderman argument. Let's add shape, same condition and experience as shape. Enderman. Endymion. End up asleep like this guy. So the cyclical process of coming to be would cease. What do you mean by that? That's Endymion. And also the saying of Anaxagoras, who would say, all things are the same. We'd all be asleep. Okay, so we've got this as 3 arguments together. But actually there's a certain order to them, isn't there? This dying process, this lame thing is actually number 1. So let's label this better. Let's give this They're all within the lesser, the dead to alive analogy, but we have this as number one. The nature would be lame, therefore the souls must have to exist. So we'll relabel this as one. The second one was we end up as Enderman. So that's our secular. So souls must exist, number one. It's a secular process of coming to life. So let's highlight that and move that down here. Number two. And number three is the process of the argument of resources. We would use up our resources if we didn't come to be from the dead. If we came to be from the living realm, we'd run out of physical resources to make human beings. So that's 1, 2, and 3. Might as well get it in the right order. This stream goes well with Project Zomboid. I hear Jed talking as the street is filled with the undead, and only philosophy matters at that point. Could we call necessity the god or the principle the good? Well, that's a good question. Whatever is the principle upon which we're judging whether or not these arguments are convincing to us is whether there's some beauty in the arguments, but also whether there's a necessity. So, it's a good question. If we never see necessity itself, as we never see beauty itself, could that principle upon which we judge a necessary argument also be the idea of the good? If there are many gods, or if necessity says there is only one, you asked your sister. I hope your sister is wise. Well, yeah, that's the idea, right? The many gods represent the many ideas, the many aspects of the single God, the brilliant light of being. Being itself is a single experience, and the demiurgos, so the creator God, if it's responsible for its creation of the physical world, that follows. But intellectually, we can distinguish aspects, so we can say there are many gods. And Proclus even points out there are levels within that same triad that we see as fundamental, also has its own existence within the realm of being. So there are different levels of gods, levels of aspects within the single aspect of the single God of being. One of them might be self-necessity. And if eidos is a thing thinking upon itself, and if not, it changes to not itself. Right, so there's what is the realm of being doing to maintain its own existence, and what is it doing with itself? This idea of ousia, its essence, is a reflection upon itself. And there are texts, I think it's the Simmias, which talks about how not only that, it's the model. If it's the model for creation, if what we're doing is learning the logos, which is the model or paradigm, then it must also be the model for whatever created it. If we're recognizing an intellectual and understandable and knowable structure within all realities, every level that we call logos, giving us that ladder to climb back up, then that must be part of the model for creation. And if we recognize that being itself has that within itself, we can conclude that, maybe its reflection upon itself not only maintains its self-existence, but gives it the model for creation. It's using itself as a model for creation. So it's reflecting upon itself and then reflecting down to the lower level. God using the demiurgos, God using itself as the model for creation. Then, of course, we look for threes. If there's a self-ousia, a emanation ousia, can there be a reversion ousia? Is there a way when we are in that state of consciousness, that state of being, of that demiurgo's being, to revert not only upon ourselves, but upon our cause? Because that would give us a nice three or triad of ousias. Or, and, saw, and. Logic gates, right. But we have to keep in mind what is the paradigm we're following, because we have to recognize that there is a moral imperative to also be using the philosophy to understand the nature of the soul, so you can understand the nature of good that's only encountered when you purify yourself in the death experience of separating the soul from the body, which is why we're going through the arguments to convince ourselves it's possible, see the necessity for it being possible, so that you can encounter the good and recognize that whatever you use your computer programming for, make sure it's in service of the good. Make sure you value the soul and selves of all people. Don't just use it to make mousetraps and nuclear bombs, as the saying goes. As they're saying, all modern science is good for mousetraps and nuclear bombs. We want to, right. Don't want it for tyranny, which is what we talked about with the negative virtues. Negative virtues are the vices. We talked about the negative virtues. What is missing from the negative virtues? Where is that? Yeah. The negative virtues. Kind of skill in pursuing your vices. Kind of skill in pursuing your pleasures. Intemperate temperance. Going out into the world and pursuing things that are normally thought of as scary, like death, out of fear and necessity, not out of a understanding and a logos of truth about the soul. Having a clarity of sight, caring for yourself, seeing and planning and understanding, that's like wisdom, gives you a kind of phronesis directed to the body. So the vices are the shadows of virtue. So that's 69, if you're following the text. We call this simple-minded experience of sound-mindedness, temperance, turns out to be like this. Fearing to be deprived of those other pleasures which you desire. So keeping away from some for the sake of being mastered by others. Even though they do indeed call being under the rule of pleasures a vice, lasciviousness, and what is equally the case for the selves is that to master certain pleasures in order to be mastered by other pleasures. This then is what we mentioned just now, that they have been made a kind of body phronesis by intemperance. And one of the translations was they've got temperance by intemperance. That's why we have to read the Balboa so we can see the word as phronesis. But it's a good thing to have the other translation because it's a nice way of saying it. Does ousia cause a gust of phronesis like a fan blade? Interesting. Take that with you as a question. What is the relationship between ousia and phronesis? Because we can see, if you're mastering most of your pleasures, you're not being pulled in many different directions, so you'll be able to reflect on yourself, but you're only reflecting on the pleasure that you want to be mastered by in vice. So we say the ones that can do the worst things, have the most vice, have a shadow. Here. Very different is virtue that is exchanged for one another without phronesis, by being that which is a certain outline of a shadow and possesses neither soundness, health is a word, health, or truth, and is truly fit for slaves. It's unhealthy for you. The only valid currency for which all the virtues which must be exchanged necessarily is phronesis. And we saw in Book 7 of the Republic, phronesis is a more divine virtue that's innate within us, unlike the other virtues where we put in through habit and discipline and practice. Right. So the more clever you are, as we saw in Book 7 of the Republic, the more you can play out your vices. Right. So the more awesome you are, the more of a moral imperative you have to master true philosophy and purify yourself in this way. So from those three together, it appears that it's definitely the case, and we are not being thoroughly beguiled. So again, we're not being tricked. So would it be harder to be smarter if you have a more complex and unruly creature to train? Right, that's why we practice the virtues. Become less unruly, more unified within ourselves. So temperance, again, check out Mindy's version, all about Platonism, recent video on temperance, is unifying yourself. Having a singular function makes you less of an unruly creature. And Socrates is saying, hey, this is what it means to be in a body. It pulls you this way and that way. So, how did he say it? Comes flooding in. Yeah. This is what he says about what it's like to be in a body. If there was a straight path with no deviations to guide us along with the Logos, that as long as we possess the body, our soul will be contaminated with a corrupting agent. We shall never sufficiently attain what we desire, and we affirm this to be the truth. From the one hand, the body keeps us busy with numberless ways. In numberless ways, through its need for sustenance. And on the other hand, when disease befalls it, it will impede our chase for being and reality. For the body fills us with many passions, desires, fears, illusions, foolishness. And as the saying goes, in truth and in reality, phronesis of any kind, not any phronesis of any kind whatsoever arises in us because of the body. For the body and its desires give us nothing other than war, civil discord, and battles. For all wars arise through the acquisition of possessions, and for the sake of the body, that we are compelled to acquire riches, being enslaved to its care. Because through and out of all this, we have no leisure for philosophy. But worst of all, the fact is, if there does arise some rest from that, we do turn to some study of philosophy. Everywhere in our search, it falls in and presents itself in a clamor and pouring in. It drives us out of our mind, so that we're not enabled by the body to behold the truth. But as it has been truly shown to us, if we ever intend to enter a certain pure state, we must be liberated from the body, and we must behold the self-realities with the self-soul. And at that time, as it seems likely, shall we attain that which we desire and that which we claim to be lovers of phronesis, when we are dead, as the Logos points out, but not while we live. It is not possible to intuitively know noesis in a pure way with the body. So moving on, we purify ourselves from the body until, so here we go. Separate from the body as much as possible, so that we neither commune with the body nor associate with it. No more than is necessary. We must not be filled with that nature. We must purify ourselves from the body until what? The divine self, God self, should liberate us, and thus being purified on the one hand by having been liberated from the phronesis of the body. He just said, no phronesis of any kind arises in us because of the body, but we are liberated from phronesis of the body. We'll be with such kinds, and through ourselves we shall know all that is pure. And that's how we know the truth. For it is not lawful to attain that which is pure by ourselves not being pure. This, Socrates, is the doctrine. We have to repeat it and believe it. At least all those who are right lovers of learning. That's the end of the doctrine. So whatever the phronesis is not happening because of the body. However, you can develop a certain connection, separation from the body when you master some of your vices, some of your pleasures. So you do acquire some kind of phronesis, but he's saying that's phronesis, body phronesis, the corrupted phronesis that allows you to be better at vice. The doctrine. Yes. Reread it. Because we are supposed to repeat it and believe it. So, if we are to pull this stunt off, we need to have an understanding why there must be the case that we do have an immortal soul. So how is he convincing us? We've got the first argument that it has to come from somewhere. The second argument that shows us that it has to be cyclical. What was it? The first argument showed us that if our soul comes here from somewhere other than being alive, it has to be from the dead. Therefore, the soul exists in that place. Need more? Okay. We can easily see that there's a process of dying. Therefore, nature would be lame if it didn't also have a process of generation. Therefore, the souls of the dead do exist. If it wasn't a secular process, we'd all end up in the same condition, experience, and shape, like Enderman, asleep. Therefore, it's a secular process of returning to life. If, argument 3, number 3, we've got to write that down. If the source of what the souls that we see in our world are from the physical world, then we'd run out of resources. Because physical sources are limited, definite. That's why capitalism is stupid. Right? Infinite growth. Maximizing individual profit for a small selection of human beings at the expense of the suffering and the enslavement of the rest of the planet and the using up of our resources, not using them in a rational way, sustainable, renewable, beneficial way. So therefore, we have to come to be from other resources than fossil fuels. Therefore, it has to be from the afterlife. What next? Right, yes. Good. In the chat, I need to write them down, make them my own. You do, yes, that's good. Write them down, make them your own. Say them in your own words. Bug your friends. Practice on your friends, not bug your friends. Benefit the souls of your friends. Put it in your art. Okay. So what happens after the Enderman argument? Here we go. Certainly Socrates. So Cebes gives us an argument. So we have Cebes jumping in, giving us his own. Cebes. Cebes. Argument. Certainly, Socrates, such is also the case indeed if the doctrine is true, and you have a custom to say often, all right, so he's pulling from his experience being a friend of Socrates during his life, that learning happens for us, nothing other than recollection. So the argument of the immortality of the soul through the idea of learning as recollection. Let's write that down. Learning. Learning as recollection. And you'll see this all through Plato's texts. Socrates using various different arguments, like in the Meno, to show, hey, you have to have known this somewhere. How can you get knowledge if you don't have it in some way already? What are you going to pour it into one ear? It has to be in there. And he uses arguments like in the Meno where he says, hey, by the way, let's have a right angle triangle like this. What can you say about the size of this? Says to some slave boy. What can you say about the size of this? And then he asks some questions, say, oh, by the way, can you see how this and this fit in together in here? Oh, wait, not like that, is it? Or is it? Yeah, like this. And he realized the size of that and the size of that is the size of this. He goes, by the way, you know what you're saying? This line is, if you call this line A, then you make a square. It's A times A. That's A squared. If you call this B, that's B times B. You make that a square. It's like a rectangle. B squared. A squared plus B squared equals this line squared. C squared. This. He says this in the Meno. He says, hey, have you done math before? No. Then how did you work out? Did I tell you? No. I just asked you questions. I pulled from you an understanding of the Pythagorean theorem. Pythagorean theorem. So this is A, B, and C. Just by asking you questions. Isn't that cool? So he asks Meno, where did he get it from? So this was in the Meno. This is in the Meno. It's a cool little one, little text. So that's a little side. We'll move it over here. Whoop. Whoop. Oh, goodness. There we go. One side is the shadow of the longer and the other of the shorter. The third is the longest. Right, this is longer. This is the... It's not well drawn. Maybe I should draw it better. This is a straight line. This is a straight line. And this is the hypotenuse. And this means this is the right angle. And so we have A, B, and C. All right. So, Socrates, you've been telling us this for a long time. Accordingly, then, we have necessarily learned at some previous time, that which we now recollect. You had to have learned it somewhere. This would be impossible if our soul did not exist somewhere before she came into exist in this human form. So that according to this doctrine, the soul must necessarily be something that is immortal. All right. So, let's break this down. Learning through recollection. We have necessarily learned at some previous time before the human form. Therefore, the soul is likely to be something that is immortal. Again, likely. These are hypotheses. These are if statements, which means they go into your if sack. Because we are taking with us questions and logos and patterns and skill trees and so on. But we also have, here we go. This is us. Take hypotheses with you in your if sack. So that when you can pull this stunt off, You can confirm your hypotheses in your direct experience. That's the transition from dianoia through logical, reasoned understanding to nous. Okay, so he gives us either a demonstration or a definition. He says, if learning is recollection, necessarily learnt at a previous time, necessarily learned at a previous time, that would be impossible if our soul were not somewhere before, if our soul were not somewhere before she came to exist, before she came to exist in this human form. Therefore, according to this doctrine, the soul is likely to be immortal. Therefore, soul is likely immortal. So, let's look at his reasoning here. We've got premise, if learning is recollection, 2, consequence, necessarily we learnt at a previous time, number 3, impossible if our soul were not somewhere before she came to exist in this human form. This is the contradiction or what's necessary via contradiction. Whoops, make some more room for that. Necessary via contradiction. Oh, so messy. So necessary by contradiction, and then 4, conclusion. Okay, simple 4-step argument. Like we have never seen a real 3, but only a representation of number 3, but an imposter. But we have seen the real number as how we would recollect it without already... Yes, how would we recollect it without already having come into contact with it? The only time I've seen a real 3 walking around is those giant fuzzy 3s on Sesame Street that have crazy conversations about cookies. So we can see 1, 2, 3, 4. Premise, axiom. This is the axiom. This is what you have to take for granted. The consequence, necessarily learned at a previous time. Then what's necessary? This must be necessary via contradiction. If this this is the absurdity that would follow if this opposite was the case. Therefore, the conclusion is the true has to be the case. Socrates argues with this. He shows the often he shows the The necessity through showing the absurdities that follow with its contradiction. If he's arguing with someone, often Socrates will say, okay, let's take your reasoning as true. Let's see what follows. Push the implication. If an absurdity follows, then we can claim, well, that must be the case that the other is correct. So let's make this a bit neater. And whoops. And let's see if we can see the structure in the. We have something interesting here. We've seen. This is Simmias Cebes making the argument. This is Beavis, or Butthead. The premise. This is something you take for granted. You could say it's an axiom. Actually, let's use a different color because it's kind of hard to see that. Premise. This is the premise that we have to take for granted. So we've been talking about the Penrose principle. You can't have a self-sustained and complete theory of anything. You have to accept the premise from a higher level of reality first to create Euclid's complete system of geometry, for example. But that's good for us because that means that if you completely understand something, there is necessarily a premise that you have to accept from a higher dimension, meaning Logos gives you a ladder upwards. Because what we're learning is not just complete understanding, it's something that can change our consciousness. It's a mystical, it's spiritual, it's human development, not just smarty pants development. The fact that it outpaces, yes, the Logos outpaces empiricism, because empiricism necessarily has to accept certain premises to be true, and you ask the question, well, where do those premises come from? Or, if it's self-contained, it's not complete. You can't have both. That's Penrose principle. So if a premise or an axiom, if it's true that learning is recollection, and I've been hanging around with you, Socrates, for a long time, and you've shown this many times. Number two, this is what follows. Or this is what follows. Or this is what the necessary implications. Let's say consequence or implication. And then if the opposite, this is what follows. Contradiction through the implications of its opposite. And then finally, conclusion. So, what do we see here? We see 1, 2, 3, 4.
Wow. 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 Wow.
So let's pull out our 4 skill tree. What's in our 4 skill tree? Well, can we say this is a kind of definition? We take this definition as axiomatic, as a necessary premise. Do we see how does this definition function or demonstration? Definition. Learning is recollection. That's we're defining a premise. Okay, how does that function? Necessarily, we learned it at a previous time. Implication or consequence is a kind of demonstration of that definition. This is what follows. This is how it functions. Then, can we divide it up into other ideas? Division. What other ideas? Well, let's take, by the way, we can say what follows both if it is and if it isn't. So what follows is others to others, both if it is and if it is not. We're taking this one. Others to others if it is and is not. So we're pushing the implications, what follows, others to others. It would be impossible if our soul were not somewhere before. So here's our somewhere. She came to exist in this human form. So our soul is one of the others, which is necessarily learnt. Let's see if we can find the S's and O's. Learning is recollection. S itself. So that recollection, how does it relate to the soul? Learnt at a previous time. Okay, what's the division? Soul, our soul is the other. Soul in relation to what? Relation to our human form. Therefore, the other, which was the soul, how does it relate to the subject? Immortal. So yeah, so we can take this simple argument and we can look for the structure of the dialectic. So taking the implications of the division, synthesizing it together into a conclusion. Synthesis. N-T-H-A. Synthesis. That's not how you spell synthesis. How do you spell synthesis, chat? Logos intelligence with easily complete. This is like a STE machine. Like a computer is off or on. And the off is off and the on is on, or the off is on and the on is off. Input to output. Right, so you can take off and on maybe as self and other. What are the self to self, self to other, on to off to off, on to on. It's a fun way of looking at it. How do you spell synthesis? I'll look it up. No. E-S-I-S. S-Y-N-E-S-I-S. Thank you. On or off is always in a state, like a state of mind. Oh, interesting. Right. I see what you're saying. Right. So, the dialectic has two forms. It has these four, the SOs, for if it is or if it isn't. It either is or is not. So you have to take either. So you could say, well, this is a state of mind that follows. Right. And there are certain states of mind. There's certain states of mind that follow for you if you think that the soul is, it exists immortally. And there's certain states of mind that follow for you if you don't. And if you rank those states of mind, you would have a kind of ordering of psychic development. So synthesis, analysis, we synthesize this argument into its conclusion, and we analyze, we relate it back to the subject. So we're learning something about Simmias. Is it Simmias? Cebes. Cebes has spent time with Socrates, and he has recognized the learning through recollection argument, and he has some level of mastery of the dialectic. So let's see if we can find the S's and O's. If learning is a recollection, so learning is the S. Learning as recollection. Dialectic has two primary ideas, S and O. And we rub them together to learn something. Necessarily, it has learned at a previous time. So learning in relation to the soul. So how does it function in relation to learning in relation to soul? So there's our S and O. Let's do it. So we've got a kind of definition. So we're doing it right now. What's the definition of our hypothetical dialectic? S equals learning, O equals soul. Okay, what do we do now? We have to demonstrate it. We're demonstrating it in here. What do we do next? Divide it up. Push it into its key elements. Okay? Which means we have to keep going. Push the implications. Push the implications. Either the implications of what it is or of its opposite. In his argument, he did the opposite. So let's push the implications and let's do the rest of this dialectic, this demonstration of what we're defining. And let's do number 3, O to O. That would mean pushing the implication, right? By the way, if we push the implication and a contradiction shows, then we can say our theory was wrong and we can learn something. Yes, there's a strong Latin component to our English language, which is why we have to add certain Greek ideas that don't exist in there. Okay, so definition. What's our definition? Let's put our, because we don't just define things, we demonstrate it ourselves, okay? So we are our dialectic. What's our definition? Well, our hypothesis, or our axiom, or premise, or the axiom, either of those fits. What's the theory that we're taking for granted here? That S equals learning and O equals soul. Okay, that's our dialectic we're doing right now. Okay? Number 2. What's our demonstration? We over here, building a SO, what do you call it? Building an SO what? Graph? It's not a graph, is it? Table. An SO, building an SO dialectic table. Number 3, division, or pushing the implications. Pushing the implications. Yeah, run out of space. Delete. Pushing the implications. Implications. Either of what is. Either of what is or of opposite. And look for necessary or contradictions. Okay, this is the division. Okay, so do we see it in the text? Definition, learning is recollection. Demonstration, how does it function? Necessarily learned at a previous time. Encapsulation, of like a short form division, like an encapsulation of what follows. Now push the implications. It would be impossible if our soul were not somewhere before she came to exist, okay? This implication, he chose the if it isn't. He could have chosen either. If it isn't. If it were not somewhere before she came to exist in a human form, what follows? It would be impossible. So you could pick either or, if it is or if it isn't. And you look for contradictions or what must be necessary. In this case, we chose what if the soul doesn't exist. So if not, then we get a contradiction. Contradiction. It's impossible. Therefore, that gives us our conclusion that it must be so. Therefore, the soul must be immortal. Okay? That's what we're doing as well. We are using the dialectic to learn about the dialectic in here, which is very Usia-like. Russian dolls and Russian dolls. Okay? So our dialectic, what's our definition or hypothesis or premise or axiom? That, it's a different color. Whoop. That S is learning and O is soul. Okay, cool. Now, what's our demonstration? How are we demonstrating our premise? We are building an SO table. Oops. We're building a SO dialectic table over in the corner, over there, where the arrow was pointing. Okay. Now, why do we do that? What do we do now? We have to push the implications, either what is or the opposite, and look for what is necessary or contradictions. Okay. So that, for us, that would be filling out the rest. The rest blindly and then referring back after after doing so. So pushing the implications of our theory that we're demonstrating. Truth table for logic. Yes, dialectic truth table. So let's do it. Okay, if our premise is learning is to the soul, then we need O to be the soul. So our question is, how does the soul relate to either itself or another other? Okay, what would be the most likely other that the soul would relate to? Well, if we've got being that we're recollecting relates to self to others, the soul, what does the soul relate to? The body. So we'll say the human body. And then we would say, okay, then how does the human body relate back to either the human body or the soul? One of those two. How does it relate back to learning? Or the implications that follow from there, there'll be certain key idea that follows. So a certain key idea that follows the division or the pushing the implications of what is or its opposite. So pushing the implications of what follows from the soul in relation to its body. If the soul that has been affected by learning. So if this, so it all rolls together, rolls on. So we have this learning as recollection, then affects the soul, then the soul therefore affects the human body, and then something of that interaction will be the key term that will help us understand learning better. Okay? So this soul that is learning through recollection is the soul here. So the soul that is recalling truth before its birth, a key idea from that will surface. So what can we say about the soul relating to the human body in that sense? The soul is what gives the immortality. So a key idea. Let's say example, immortality. Used. So that's synthesis. So let's call that synthesis, keodality. That's synthesis. A key idea that arises from the division. Used to understand learning better. So that's our hypothesis. Now let's see if that follows or not. We did it without looking back. And now, so that's our division. That would be pushing the implications of our theory. Because it's more fun to do a dialectic ourselves while learning about the dialectic to see if he's got a dialectic behind his thinking. We might be wrong. Okay, so what do we do now? Synthesis. Analysis. Which is the conclusion. Or conclusion. Which is was our dialectic consistent? Consistent or consistent or necessary? Or inconsistent or contradictory with Cebes. Cebes' own dialectic. And what will that do? Okay, so this is the conclusion, has to relate back to the start. So in the start was our thesis that S is learning and O is soul. That's the synthesis part, and also the analysis part. That's synth. And the analysis part is therefore our theory that Cebes is thinking and using a dialectic with S equals, what was it? S equals learning, O equals soul. It's learning. And O equals soul. To better understand one of those through rubbing against the other. I say rubbing against because we're using the metaphor of rubbing two sticks together to gain insights. That's what we're using from our skill tree. Like we've seen, oh, this triad, rub it against this triad, can you gain a new insight? But also, that's the essence of learning. Rub this metaphor against this metaphor. Hey, can you understand a king better by rubbing up it against what you know about it being a shepherd. That's the basis of thought, rubbing two sticks together. In fact, that expression, rubbing two sticks together to get a spark, is what Plato uses in his 7th letter, I think. He talks about that's how you gain insight to his true doctrine. Because in Plato's letters at the end of his life, I think he talks about how his actual doctrine can't be written about, he doesn't think. You have to rub two things together to get it. And in the Republic, I think it's mentioned the same metaphor is used. You're rubbing against the idea of the soul with the metaphor of the city-state. You rub it together and you're supposed to spark a light. Remember, all the way through, we've been talking about it comes to light. It has come to light, Socrates. It's come to light, Socrates. There's something about rubbing two ideas together brings an insight to light. Interesting, because the very next argument we're about to go through is about sticks. Rubbing two sticks together brings a spark. That's the metaphor. And then Socrates is saying, hey, that's their purpose. In the next argument, he's about to say, oh, all sticks have a purpose. They desire to be equal to the self. But they're always going to fall short in their physical form. But they serve a purpose. You wouldn't begin the philosophical quest to know what the realm of being is unless you saw two sticks and you realize, hey, these two sticks are kind of equal, but fall short. But if they're not quite equal, but I think of them as equal because they look pretty equal, then where do I get the idea of equal from? That's necessary. It has a purpose. Well, I mean, like, rubbing two... Okay. Don't you rub two sticks together to start a fire or something? Maybe certain kinds of sticks. Okay, in the chat, metal and rock are better for starting fires. Okay. What's a grapha dogmata mean? In the chat. Mm-hmm. Rubbing two rocks together. All right. So that's just interesting that this idea of rubbing two things together is the essence of dialectic. You pick an S, you pick an O, you rub them together to better understand them. And of course, we talked about Parmenides in the previous read-along. He rubs the idea of one with the idea of self. And then maybe there's a hidden dialectic within that of rubbing the idea of is with exists. That was a little theory that came up in our read-along. Oh, grapha dogmata means never wrote your own down. Interesting. Referring to Plato saying, I didn't quite write down exactly what my doctrine is. But, so we rub, where are we? Synthesis. How do we synthesize our little dialectic we're doing? So we're doing a dialectic over here to understand the dialectic of Cebes. And also we're doing a third dialectic, which is a dialectic on our dialectic. How can we understand what we're doing and why we're doing it with the dialectic? So it's dialectics in dialectics. So that's pretty cool.
Wow.
So this dialectic on our dialectic, this is a dialectic on our dialectic. So I guess if we're doing a dialectic on our dialectic, we have to find the two things rubbing together. What are they? Okay, this is pretty cool. Okay, so pushing the implications of this idea that we're doing a dialectic on our dialectic. What's the S? What are the two things rubbing together? Well, the first thing rubbing together is the model of dialectic. Model of dialectic. What are we rubbing it up against to better understand either of them? Our dialectic on Cebes dialectic. Pretty funny. I think that's cool. Cebes is dialectic. So we're rubbing these two together, the model of dialectic with our dialectic on Cebes' dialectic, to better understand one of them. Which one are we trying to better understand? Well, kind of both. That's the fun thing about the dialectic. You better understand both. You'll better understand the model of dialectic, which is one of our ultimate goals. That's why we're doing this. That's why we're meeting together. And yes, recursive dialectic. Yes. But also, we are better understanding our dialectic that we're doing ourselves. So we're doing both. It's cool. You learn. That's what we've recognized in our skill trees, all right? Like we saw the triad of the soul. How can you relate that to the triad of the virtues? Well, if there's a reasoning part, an outwardly moving and an inwardly moving, does that help us better understand wisdom, courage, and temperance? What about the triad of being, power, and activity? We can rub all three of them together to better understand each one of them. So that's what we've been doing all the way through when we've been developing our skill trees of triads. And now we've got a skill tree of, that same principle of rubbing two things together we're doing here. That's the principle that allows us to level up in that way is inherent to the structure of the dialectic. If the dialectic is the most basic structure or paradigm, yes, and we actually rubbed in a previous talk, we rubbed it up against the Triforce of Zelda, because we were also relating it to another Triforce of mythology, philosophy, and philosophical midwifery, or removing philosophical midwifery, or mythology, logos, and anti-logos. And we related it to Zelda's triad, which is mythology, of his Triforce of, what do you remember the Triforce? What are the three terms in Zelda's Triforce? Courage, power, and something else. Yes, and all three of them are Triforces, aren't they? So that also is Triforce. I think wisdom maybe is one of them. Courage, wisdom, and power. Which is interesting because they're actually self-er terms, but he's mixing triads. Courage and wisdom are to do with the virtues. Power is to do with the being, power, activity triad. And also they're not in the right spots. So that's how we're understanding Socrates saying, hey, my dreams say create music, create stories. But I'm not much of a poet. I'm not much of a music maker. So I'm going to take the poetry of Aesop and rearrange it to make it right. So in a similar way, we rearrange the Triforce of Zelda, which is a popular mythology like Aesop for Socrates' time, to make it consistent with the logos. So, and Socrates says, do both. All right, so we're rubbing our model of the model of the dialectic against our dialectic on Cebes' dialectic. And how do we conclude? How do we make a conclusion in step 4? Let's just review what we got so far. Right, Triforce of Wisdom. Power, courage, and wisdom, right. And they were all their own Triforces together to make a Triforce, which is interesting because we can see that there's a power being activity in wisdom. There's a power being activity in courage. There's a power being activity in temperance. Even in the dialectic. Yeah, it sounds like Plato. He's close. We have 4 parts in the dialectic, and each of them you can have a triad. You can say what's true about it, what's false about it, and what's both true and false in each of them. Okay, so what's the dialectic on our dialectic? Okay, we are going to start with an axiom or hypothesis or definition that S will be learning and O will be soul in Cebes' thinking. Demonstration, we'll start building an SO dialectic table, and we started here. Division, or pushing the implications, either what is or isn't, and then looking for what is necessary or contradictions. We're going to fill out the rest of it without looking back at the dialectic, and then refer back after doing so. synthesis and analysis. Was our dialectic consistent or necessary, or inconsistent or contradicting with Cebes' own dialectic? Analysis. Therefore, we can conclude that our theory that Cebes is thinking or using a dialectic with S is learning, O is soul, to better understand one of those through rubbing against the other is true. True. So therefore, how do we better understand the subject? Therefore, we better understand Cebes. Cebes' thinking and philosophical development, or in a word, learning. We're better understanding Cebes' personal learning. So, Cebes is using a dialectic on learning. We are going to learn about Cebes' dialectic by pulling apart the terms. To do so, we are doing our own dialectic on it. But we are also going to do this dialectic on our dialectic to better understand dialectic itself, so we can ourselves learn. And we are going to test if our dialectic is right using this dialectic to recognize, hey, we're going to see if it's consistent, and if it is, we are going to therefore conclude about Cebes' own thinking and his learning. So Cebes is doing a dialectic on learning. We are learning his dialectic on learning. We are learning the dialectic itself by doing a dialectic ourselves. We are learning the pattern of learning the dialectic by doing a dialectic on our own learning. As a result, number 5, as a result of our dialectic on learning, we can come to a conclusion about Cebes' learning. And then finally, after going through all that, we will have learned ourselves about what is involved in the learning process. Wow! It's dialectics and learnings all the way down. Isn't that cool? What do you say, Owen?
Wow. 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 Wow.
Okay. So, and we can, by the way, we can better, having gone through this dialectic, just here, on the dialectic, we can also refer it back to our original definition to better understand it. Okay, so what's our conclusion? Therefore, we'll better understand Cebes' thinking and learning. That's the goal. That's why we did this all to begin with. But we can take that back to the start. Having gone through the dialectic, can we better understand our own dialectic? Well, hang on a second. Our premise, our definition, our hypothesis was these are the two things. So we could say, if we're after understanding Cebes' thinking, we could say the first S term is Cebes' learning. Cebes' learning. So what can we say about self to self? This self is this. This here. So how can you understand Cebes' learning? That he is using a dialectic of S equals learning and O equals soul. So we better understood our own definition by having gone through it. That's how dialectic works. It's self-referring. You go through it, and what you thought you knew at the beginning, you better understand. So we can actually better clarify our dialectic to see what is our dialectic actually on. Cebes is learning. That's the first S. What's the second S? Like, what can you say about it itself? Well, so our first category is what can you say about Cebes' learning, self to self. So what is Cebes' learning? He's using the dialectic of this. So this S is this. Cool? In the chat, it sounds like base building in Factorio. I need to play that game. The first base isn't a base. The base only comes about at the end and is now a reason to be what it is. And that goal, whatever it is, of the factory. Interesting. I have to check out the game Factorio. So isn't that cool? We went through a dialectic on our dialectic and better understood our own second dialectic. So it's our second dialectic, we could say. Or it's a dialectic on our second dialectic. So we realize, oh, the whole thing is our dialectic is on Cebes' learning. So let's go back. What's our hypothetical dialectic? S to S. Cebes is going to say learning as recollection. He's going to relate it to the soul. So our hypothesis, our definition of our hypothesis is S is learning, O is soul. Our next hypothesis is soul is probably going to be related to the next thing down, the human body. And then he's going to have a key idea from that relationship, like immortality, and he's going to use that to better understand learning, or to understand learning, or the O term, learning or soul better. Either one. So, where are we in our dialectic so far? Well, we started with our definition and we refined it. So this is our dialectic. We're going to better understand Cebes' learning, how he thinks, how he's learned in his life, a life spent as a friend of Socrates, by hypothesizing that he is going to be engaging in a dialectic because Socrates has been doing the conversation. Then Cebes jumped in. Hey, Socrates, take a break from giving arguments to us about why the soul must be immortal. I'm going to have a go. Give me a stab, which is cool. He's jumping in, he's playing. So our Cebes is learning. What can we say about it? Self to self. Well, this self he's going to be doing a dialectic in using S as learning, O as soul. And that's going to be his learning. That's going to represent his learning. Tell us about him. Okay, demonstration. We started to build the table. And then we jumped over here and realized, okay, let's keep going. Let's risk it. And division, push the implication of our premise and finish the dialectic table. And then after filling out the rest, then referring back after doing that. So that would be pushing the implications of our theory. And then to synthesis, we'd make our own conclusion and to see if our dialectic conclusion is either consistent or inconsistent. And then we can, if it is consistent, we can therefore understand Cebes' thinking, understand Cebes' level of learning better. In the chat, once I get a good grasp of the logos of logic of dialectic, I can feel it trying to work. Right, that's great. Keep practicing. And everything you learn, make a dialectic about it. It's only 4 steps, and an A and a B side, if it is and if it isn't. Okay, so we're at the division stage, pushing the implications. We did that, and now we have to synthesize it. Okay, we are going to see if a key idea from the relationship of the soul to the human body has emerged, like immortality, and is that being used to better understand either S, learning, or O, the soul better? Let's see if it's either going to be consistent or inconsistent with what he does. Okay, let's see. Cebes' argument: if learning is recollection, necessarily learned at a previous time, impossible. If our soul, okay, so he's relating it to the soul, were not somewhere before she came to exist in its human form, there we have the O of the soul and the other O of human form. So there's our relating it to we said human body, but it's not the same, but it's still consistent or necessary. Is the human form necessarily the human body? Yes. So far we're consistent. Therefore, in his conclusion, the soul is likely immortal. A key term, we actually guessed it. Immortality resulted from this division step. So a key term emerged, that synthesis that we can relate back to the start to either understand the S, learning, or the O, soul. And we are using it to better understand the soul. The soul is likely immortal. So therefore, it's consistent. Therefore, we can come to a conclusion about Cebes. Cebes, having spent his time with Socrates during his life, has learnt to a level where he's able to use the dialectic, picking out two key terms to make an argument consistent with the argument on the table, consistent with the conversation, as a result from Socrates' influence. So we can learn not only about Cebes' learning, but Socrates' learning. Socrates has himself learnt the dialectic such that he is being a positive influence on his friends. He is benefiting them. Why? Because we can see, so we can also say, hey, we can do a dialectic on Socrates' learning of the dialectic relative to Cebes. Okay? So we could do that. Let's do that right now. So we could say, pick another color. We could say, let's go yellow. How can we understand, zoom in a bit, Socrates' learning in his life is the S term relative to Cebes' learning during that time spent with Socrates, which is the O term. You could rub those together. In fact, you could do it yourself. Having seen something about Cebes' learning, we can rub that against Socrates and say, well, okay, not only were we vindicated, did we validate through going through a dialectic our theory that Cebes is using the dialectic, and therefore we can make a conclusion that Cebes has learned. He's learned the dialectic enough to use it. Pretty good. In a convincing argument. Simple, concise, 4 steps, really concise. Sufficient, we would say. Sufficient and efficient for the 2 key words. Let's pull up. And okay, so let's take this and do another dialectic and relate it back to Parmenides. Okay? We're learning about Cebes' learning. Cebes has learned from his influence of Socrates. Therefore, we can make a conclusion about Socrates. We can do that dialectic. Therefore, Socrates has himself not only mastered his dialectic, he was able to use it in talking about this learning as recollection in a way that allowed Cebes to learn himself, to learn in the dialectic, because here he is functioning with his dialectic. And the doctrine of Socrates is that it's the functioning of the dialectic, the mastery of the dialectic, separating from our physical body. Hey, Cebes didn't have to point to anything physical. This is purely reasoning. That this is the true quest of philosophy, the way of doing philosophy rightly. And it's also a mystic tradition. And it's the yoga of how to separate from our soul so that we can be receptive to the divine self initiating us into the experience of pure being. And when we are able to separate completely from our body, we have to make sure that we're still doing the dialectic. We collect ourselves together. We're not going to be able to do it physically because we're not going to be physical. You're not going to pull yourself together, like pull yourself together, son, which means be tense, be on edge, pull yourself together. We can't do it through physical. So when we do separate from the body, we have to be doing this. So not only is the dialectic a preparation for separating from the body, but when we do separate, it's a way of collecting ourselves together with a single phronesis, a single virtue of focus, so that we're not flying around the room we are able to engage in the dialectic better. There's a way of collecting yourself out of the body. And therefore, if that's his doctrine, and we saw hidden in our big, after we did a dialectic on his doctrine, including the separation of the soul from the body, we realized, oh, he's talking about the dialectic, the very thing we're doing. Again, recursive. So if that's the doctrine, that not only has he been able to do it, he's been able to teach it to somebody else. And if this is what brings you to, let's go back to our dialectic on if philosophy exists in this way. Here, if philosophy exists, then he's able to bring his friend from the B side of the argument, if philosophy doesn't exist, which brings us to war, discord, battles. We kill ourselves, we fight and hurt each other, we fear death. This is how we relate to our own souls and others. He brought Cebes away from this into the true activity of philosophy, which allows us to pursue dying and being dead through the dialectic, the turning around. It liberates us. It's a purification. It brings us what we most love, self-phronesis. So this is you referring back to a previous dialectic we did. So this is why dialectic is handy. You can tie it back. This is sewing it together with the weapon called the sewing needle of infinite truths. You sew it together. Okay? So we can sew it back together and say, okay, well, his friend was moved from here to here, from the negatives that follow to the positives that follow. Purification, liberation. You no longer fear death. You can encounter truth and being through the dialectic. Purifies and liberates from the body and our troubles, and enables the soul to acquire truth and phronesis and reach being. So all of those things together literally is what benefit is. So not only was Socrates himself mastered his doctrine, he was able to function with it in a beneficial way, bring others into the game. Say like this:
I'm looking for someone to share in an adventure.
And therefore benefit his friends. Because we see Cebes using that dialectic that he just outlined and hid for us. By the way, we wouldn't have seen it if we hadn't done a dialectic on it, which is sort of like a not gatekeeping, but a kind of barrier of entry. Like, it's not for everyone. You have to have come along and you have to have persisted to see it for yourself. Right. Needed, necessarily, and needed, necessarily, and beneficial as a kind of triad. Add it to your triad inventory, chat. So we needed to ourselves have stuck around for long enough, seen the value of it, been inspired to go along with it, and applied the dialectic to Socrates' doctrine to realize he's talking about the dialectic. So that's kind of barrier into the initiation. But having done that, we can recognize something not only for ourselves, but in how Cebes is functioning. Cebes is doing it. And what can we conclude about Cebes' use of the dialectic? Yes, it benefits everyone, not just one. Absolutely. That's why we're awakening. I'm hoping to share these this information as best as I can through this channel, because everyone needs to do it. It's literally was going to save everyone, help everyone, benefit everyone, but also save the human race from the implications of what follows if philosophy doesn't. How can you make it clear? Hey, buddy, it's not personal that your government is killing or your company is stealing, because this is simply what follows if you do not have philosophy. Why? Look at it. If philosophy if it exists, in relation to death, so this was a dialectic we did of philosophy existing in relation to death, and if philosophy does not. So this was a dialectic we did from the logos of the Phaedo. If it doesn't exist, you're concerned with eating, drinking, sexual stimulation, therapy of the body, clothes, shoes, ornaments of the body. You are a lover of body, of riches, of honors. We haven't completely finished this that we could, but we were just pulling out notes. We didn't do S to O, but we did O to O. How do we relate to other human beings? War, civil discord, battles, kill ourselves, fight and hurt each other, we fear death. And there are other implications that we put into other dialectics, like up here. We debate, we're mean, we hurt each other. Oh yeah, so if philosophy doesn't exist, how does it relate to us? It keeps us distracted from true philosophy, our true goals. It fills us with passions, desires, foolishness, illusions, and fears. So these are all kind of did a couple of different dialectics on if philosophy exists relative to the soul and relative to death. But I encourage you to read through the Phaedo and pull out your own and put your own together, so we can point out, hey, this is why we have problems. It's not personal. It's just what necessarily follows. And you'll be able to see it and understand it. Why? Because you can recognize the self-logos, because it's in you already. You can recognize a certain consistency, necessity, and beauty in this. It's not personal. We're here to do it. Literally, it's our quest. It's why we're human beings. So hey, don't take it personal that we weren't born knowing everything. Don't take it personal that you have ignorance to purify. If you didn't have ignorance to purify, you wouldn't be here in the first place. So it's not personal, but it needs to be done, because we are suffering the implications of what follows if we don't have philosophy. If we think philosophy is just opinions, it's many, it's ignorance, it's not absolute, it's not open to all, we can't all share in it. We're not united because we all have the same goal. It's the destiny of man. We all ourselves, we all are inherently philosophers, and this logos, this doctrine, is our birthright. Socrates gave us his doctrine. We just have to pick it up and read it, master it, do it. And as such, we come to a conclusion not just about Cebes' learning, but Socrates' learning, and that he was a positive, beneficial influence on his friends. Therefore, we can say he's probably going to be a positive, beneficial influence on us. Good thing we're reading the Cebes. Good thing for us. But also, let's go back to the start of his journey. Let's go back to what... before he began philosophy, before he was able to understand the nature of the realm of being, and he was using a physical language, like concepts, and taking a piece of a pie to understand how we share in the logos, how we share in being. When he was 19 and he first met his teacher, Parmenides, what did Parmenides say about him? Given what we just saw about his influence on Cebes. Okay, let's see. So this is Socrates early in his life. He says, "What then, O Parmenides, is the way of this exercise?" Parmenides says, "It's the way that you have just now heard Zeno practicing, except I was quite pleased with this that you said to him, because you would not allow him to look upon the wandering that exists among the objects of sight and the wandering that exists in relation to them, but to consider according to those which one can grasp, especially by the logos. And in this way, one will be led to see the ideas." This whole separating from our physical senses to see the ideas. Okay, so this is what he says, this is the exercise. So now this exercise has become part of his doctrine. Not only that, oh, by the way, this exercise was also called by Parmenides. He goes on to say, you have to permit the ideas of real beings to be, keep your mind fixed on the objections that come up, define each particular idea. That's where you turn dianoia. Allow that each idea, each one of the real beings is always of the self. This is the power of dialectics. So he went on to say, by the way, this exercise that you have to practice yourself in, and I'm telling you this because I could see that you didn't allow Zeno to get wrapped up in his objects of sense, which was great, but this is the exercise and we can call it dialectics. This is early, so say this is what you have to learn. And our question is, did he learn it? Did he benefit from this early conversation with Parmenides? And then finally, this quote here from Parmenides. This one here. It falls to the ability of an individual with a very good natural disposition to be able to learn that there is a certain kind of each idea, and that of self-ousia. What? According to self. And that they will deserve even greater admiration who, having made this discovery, shall be able to teach yet another person how to thoroughly well distinguish these particulars in a sufficiently efficient way. In other words, not only, Socrates, do you have to do this, you even greater admiration shall be given to you if you can help another. Now, keep in mind, this is early days of Socrates. Right, something I've noticed in the chat is that when collecting yourself, a lot of memories pop up or resurface a lot. Yes, that's part of it. Keeping in mind those objections, those distractions, those counterattacks is part of what he said you have to do. And of course, you can do it two ways. You can address the cause of them, apply the dialectic to those counterattacks, follow it up, apply the dialectic to the false self by doing a dialectic on those thoughts, right? Write them all down. How do they function? Can you list them all out? Can you find a common theme? So do a dialectic on it, and then you can trace that dialectic back to its original cause, which is like doing a dialectic on your false things. However, what you might want to do is say, look, I'm engaged in a dialectic on the self or a dialectic on the soul right now. I promise to address it later. I'm going to take out my notebook, take some notes of those thoughts and memories, write them down, and I'll come back to it later. What you'll notice is if you do that, your mind will help you. You've got a friend. Your mind is your friend. And also, when you do go back to do a dialectic on that, which is fun, by the way, it's a fun activity. I mean, if you're going to meet up with a friend for coffee, I recommend do this. I mean, you can spend the first 5 minutes talking about the sports teams or the pretty girls or whatever you do, but then get into this. Pull out your notebook and say, hey, look, I've noticed all of these thoughts. I recognize a key theme. I can pull out key ideas. I recognize a pattern. All of the things we've been learning to do to read the Phaedo, to read the Logos, you can apply to your problems. Now you've got the material. Only you're not doing this on the Logos, you're doing it on the anti-Logos or the Pathologos. Either or. So your development of these things, key terms, looking for order, developing questions, apply the dialectic method, represent it in mythology, make a song about your problems if you want. That's cool. Make a painting about it. Reflecting on it, looking for the skill trees, sewing it together with the sewing needle of infinite truths, the snit. Progression upon the causes, ousia. Ousia is, so when you do the dialectic, you'll notice certain key ideas. One will stick out, and then that becomes the title of your next dialectic. Oh, this particular idea. Every time all of these thoughts that come up have a certain theme to do with guilt. I'm just going to use guilt because we had it before. So now do it on guilt. What is guilt? How does it function to you? When does it function to you? How does it affect your relationships to others to others? And then how do you then relate back to yourself? From that, there'll be a certain key idea. Or you can say, okay, others to others. What history does it have? How far does it go back? Oh, every time I get into a relationship with this kind of girl, every time I apply for this job, keep tracing it back. A key idea that can surface can be the most prominent, the most causal, or the first, the most original. So what's the earliest scene you remember yourself in that state of mind of guilt? And then make that, so synthesis and analysis of that division into its parts, others to others, others back to self. Make that origin scene the subject of the next dialectic. So it's this recursive dialectic on dialectic on dialectic. You're rehearsing towards the cause. You're returning upon yourself but cycling up. Then apply the dialectic to that. What happened in that early scene? Who was there? Self to self. How do they look? Use self terms for self to self. Who was there? Did they look beautiful? Did they look good? How were they functioning? Self to others. And so on and so on. So however you are learning the dialectic, apply it also to your problems. Or put them aside to go back to your work. And the better you can separate from the body through the dialectic, the less you are influenced by your problems. But you have to go back and purify them too. It might help to better learn philosophy, better learn the dialectic, and then go back to your problems. But your mind might say, nope, no further until you address this. Do some work on this, and then I'll let you go further. That's our question of why Socrates is saying the purification of the soul from the body is purification, but then he went on to the virtues. Because, hey, if you don't also perfect your logos and dialectic, you might develop a certain sort of power separated from your body, but you don't want to pour it into your vices. Make sure you keep developing the logos and the dialectic. But also not just purify yourself, perfect yourself. Which means there might be a dialectic, or there is a dialectic you can apply to your problems too. So, what did Parmenides say? So we gave 3 quotes, and the final one was that we will give even greater admiration, having made this discovery, having completed this exercise that we've been talking about, can teach another person too. So having been benefited by Parmenides in this way, can also be a positive influence to others. And how can we define it? To be able to well distinguish the particulars, which we call the dialectic, in what kind of a way? A sufficient and efficient way. So, taking that as our paradigm, our model for judging Socrates' own learning in his life, waiting for the quote to disappear, can we say Cebes, as another, is thoroughly distinguishing the dialectic, the ideas, in a sufficient and efficient way? Well, let's look at it. If learning is recollection, number 1, necessarily you learnt at a previous time, number 2, that would be impossible if our soul were not somewhere before she came to exist in this human form, number 3. Therefore, conclusion, soul is likely immortal. What can we say? Sufficient? Yes. Dialectic? Yes. Using self-er terms like soul and learning and recollection and necessary? Yes. Efficient? Efficient as heck. Therefore, what do we give Socrates? A+. What do we say?
Wow. Wow. Wow.
So, that was a lot of fun. We got to practice the dialectic. We got to nail down more of a more of the arguments for our own self that we can use. These 3 about the soul, the straight line. Well, the first one was nature would be lame if we can see people in the process of dying, but not the process of coming to be. We don't want to say nature is lame, so we have to be coming from something. Therefore, the souls of the dead do exist. If this process was a straight line, we'd all end up asleep like Enderman. Therefore, it's a circular process. Number 3, if our soul came to be from a physical resource, it would be used up eventually, and therefore we have to be coming to be from the dead. All showing that it's a circular process, showing that our soul must exist before we were born in this realm of the dead, and that's from which we go through the process. So we have the state and also the process of being awake and being asleep, being alive, being dead, and the process of coming to be alive or generation and dying. We had a third argument, Cebes' argument, the learning as recollection. If we learn from recollecting, necessarily we had to have learned it at a previous time, which would be impossible if the soul were not somewhere before we were a human. Therefore, the soul has to be immortal, or is likely to be immortal. So we've got another argument there that we can use for ourselves. And in doing so, we got to practice our dialectic, which is the doctrine, and we got to learn something about Socrates' learning, Cebes' learning, and how much of a good influence Parmenides was. So this, we have to give greater admiration to those who can help another. We can say that for Parmenides, because he helped Socrates do it and pass it on. So for Parmenides, we say, clap for him. Right. Oh, sorry, I missed something in the chat. Sorry about that. Right, the thoughts that come up when I try to collect myself together are often more bad than good. Just like the mind, or also the boy as an entity with his own feelings and thoughts separate. Right, yes, right. That's good. You recognize that it has its own existence. The false idea of yourself isn't you. That's great. Right, guard against it. The problems are the bodies and opinions that are trusted, beliefs and imaginations. Right. Yes, so that's the power. So once you identify the false belief, you can recognize its power. So again, what's one of those triads? Being, what power does it have? Why was it believable? You have to believe it. If you didn't believe it, if some little kid said to you, oh, you're an alien, you wouldn't freak out. Oh my God, I can't believe I'm an alien. My whole life has been a lie. It's just some little kid. You don't believe him. But what made the person who convinced you believable? What gave it its power? Trust, beliefs, imagination. Right. So what's the activity? It plays out in your imagination, your fantasies, your daydreams. This is other to other, this activity. What power does it have when it relates to yourself? And what is the false belief itself? So here we see self, other, but we also see the triad of being, power, and activity. But you can bring all of them together. Use the soul, use reasoning, outward moving, or inward desiring. Use the virtues. Use whatever you've got, whatever you've been developing along with this podcast series in your own inventory. Apply it all. What can you see? It's only going to benefit you applying what you're learning of the logos to the text that we're reading, and also the problems that come up. Those are the two kinds of questions, koans, that we have, that we're naturally interested in, have a natural power. We're naturally interested in knowing ourselves. We're naturally interested in removing our stupid problems. Not stupid. There's a certain necessity to them. There's a certain beauty in having your problems. If you can see the whole picture of your what is needed to see that there's a certain kind of necessity, and therefore justice. Self-justice is related to self-necessity and self-beauty. Realizing that your problems are part of a cyclical process. The problems are part of a larger process of your evolution, and you're returning to life and you're dying again. Therefore, this doctrine and this arguments that we're laying out by applying the dialectic and really nailing down these arguments are necessary to see the necessity or justice and the beauty in even your own problems. And therefore, necessary to remove our problems. It's said in the Orange Book on Philosophical Midwifery that you can't get rid of your problems until you recognize the self-beauty and the self-justice in them. And there are actually dialogues that are fun where I've actually been in conversations with people who complain. They say, hey, look, I can see the necessity of it, but I'm very difficult for me. I can't accept there's a beauty in our stupid problems that play out others to others in such a disastrous way, and how they relate to my idea of myself. I end up hating myself. I can't see how that's beautiful. I can see how it's necessary as the reason for my reincarnation cyclically into this part of time, into this family. I mean, if I believe that the self was limited, I can see why I couldn't stay in the divine realm, why I had to go down to learn more and purify myself from the false logos. I can see that, but I'm having a hard time. Hey, welcome, Gravedub. I'm having a hard time seeing how it's beautiful. And we're seeing, hey, look, well, from that reflection, from what was shared in chat, applying it back, right, other back to self, to what we've just been defining ourselves. So that's the other term, other back to self. Hey, look for these 4 terms in everything you do. In what you do, are you talking about the thing itself? Are you talking about how it functions? Are you talking about the influence of that functioning in all the many different areas of your life? Dividing it up, division? into key ideas or significant ideas or most causal ideas or most primary scenes? And then are you using that to relate back to the thing you're interested in to better understand yourself? So somebody shared, oh, by the way, this is how my problem, self itself, affects me, self to others. And then we took that and related it back to this, what we had just defined ourselves. So we related that back to this, other back to self. And then that helped us to better understand it. Well, what's the importance of having these arguments about the soul? Well, if it's necessary, getting the trusting part to be put as a guard. Yes, trust. That's courage. So trusting the logos until you've developed your own dianoia, seeing the necessity and the beauty and the justice, the logical necessity and the higher necessity, and you've verified it through your own direct experience of separating the soul from the body and recognizing that you are a soul that's going through this secular process of returning to life, reincarnation, then it is a trust. But that trust is courage, trusting in the logos, desiring to reach your own dianoia and knowledge as your primary motivating desire, the reason why you master all the other desires, including those distracting thoughts that we've been talking about coming in. The reason why you purify yourself from them is not to get a lot of power so you can pursue that one desire, but so you can pursue the greatest desire, dianoia and knowledge, so you can have, what do we desire? Truth and self-phronesis, according to Socrates in this doctrine that we've just been reading in the Phaedo. So that's temperance. Wisdom is the activity of doing this dialectic. That's the activity. How do you get knowledge? Well, going back to the text. Knowledge. Let's just search for knowledge. How do you get this knowledge? Well, you got to separate your body because it comes pouring in like a clamor. That's what we talked about. You have to behold the self realities with the self soul. It's only that way that we enter a pure state where we find mindfulness, because we are lovers of mindfulness. And there's also, right, it's our understanding, our dianoia that, here we go. Have you grasped the selves and being through any of the body perceptions? I mean, self-greatness, self-health, self-strength, and in one logos, the ousia of all the others, whatever self you pick. Accordingly, of course not. Accordingly then, that which is most true of selves is contemplated. That's our meditation, our concentration. Hold on to it as a question. And you're naturally curious about yourself, and you're naturally curious about your problems, so you don't have to force it. It's fun. It's interesting. Sustained concentration is meditation. Sustained meditation is contemplation, where you can join with it. It's not through the body, but you have to prepare yourself to most accurately understand each self which you investigate. What's the model for accurately understanding whatever self that has a being? This guy. That's what we've been doing. Dialectic. 4 parts. Self, 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 other, self. Or definition, demonstration, division, synthesis, analysis. Or, as we saw in Cebes' argument, very simple. What's his definition? What's he starting with as a definition? Learning is recollection. If, by the way, these are all ifs. All understanding is ifs. You don't know until you're there. Then demonstration, how does it demonstrate itself? Necessarily, we have to have learned. If learning is recollection, necessarily we would have had to have learned it at a previous time. Divide it up. What's other to other? How does that function? Soul in relation to your body. Either if it is or if it isn't. If our soul were not somewhere, if it isn't, before she came to exist in our human form, that would be impossible. Division. How does it divide up? And then, if it is or if it isn't, either it's necessary or it's impossible. And he picked if the soul were not somewhere before the physical world, it would be impossible to have learnt at a previous time what we are learning right now. Conclusion, or synthesize your division into a key idea, relate it back to the start, other back to the start, other back to the self, back to the subject. Therefore, the soul is immortal. So this came from this, and we relate it back to this, either the self of learning or the soul. So we learn about the soul. This is just 4 sentences. So perfectly or succinctly and efficiently encapsulates the learning that Socrates says we are here to do, and Parmenides said we had to do. Therefore, as Parmenides said to Socrates when he was 19, you will deserve greater admiration having made this discovery, how to thoroughly understand each idea, how to teach another, how to thoroughly well distinguish each of these particulars in a sufficient way. Why are we talking about that now? Because in Socrates' doctrine, he says, here, what is most true of selves is contemplated not through the body, but you have to prepare yourself to most accurately understand each self which you investigate. This person will approach the closest to the intuitive knowledge of each being. There we go. In fact, that's awesome enough to make it into a quote. Do we have a quote of this already? We have something similar. Here's a quote we already have. Similar. While we live, we shall be closest to knowing when we neither associate nor commune with the body more than it is necessary. We must purify ourselves from it until the divine self should liberate us, and thus being purified by having been liberated from the phronesis of the body, we shall be likely to be with such a kind, and through ourselves we shall know all that is pure. This is likely to be the truth. Oh, sorry, Gave. If the logos from the chat, if the logos exists in its fullest form, and by philosophy we reach logos, why do we need to learn it? Why isn't it a part of our default self? Is there anything states why we are separated from it? Okay. This is the best answer I can give you for that question. Maybe not what you want to hear. Polish it up. That's a question for your question sack. If the logos exists in its fullest form, in the realm of being, from the self, in the experience of self, why incarnate through this circular process we've been talking about, to have to learn it again? If we already know it, why have to go through this learning process? That has to be a question sack question. I don't know. That's a good one. Make a question out of it, put it in its... polish it up, say it in its purest words, most sufficiently explain that question. The same thing that Parmenides is saying we do for the dialectic, and Socrates is saying is the activity of philosophy. To thoroughly well distinguish it as truly as possible without the use of your body. Do that also to your question. So we do this not just to the key terms of the text, not just to the selfer terms like beauty and justice and, in one word, the ousia of all the beings, but also do it to your questions and your hypothesis and your mythology. They go in your sack and they go into your inventory, because that's how we level up. So yeah, that's a big one. If we already know it, this is the implications of what follow from what we're just learning. If we do recognize the logos, if we do have learned the logos, if the logos is from self, why go through this forgetting process? Why have to relearn it? What's the significance of returning back to the self with the logos having been learned? Is this physical world, is this kind of incarnation the only place where we can learn the logos? Is that part of the necessity for not just the learning, but the forgetting and the suffering that we go through when we forget? All of the suffering we go through, in the Republic he calls it birthing pains. Here we say this is the war, the civil discord, the battles are all from acquiring possessions and riches. We're filled with passions, desires, fears, and illusions. We never sufficiently get what we desire, which is truth and phronesis. This is all what follows if it isn't. This is from our dialectic of if the soul alone, if it can't be on its own, separate from the body. So all our suffering comes from not having this. Then why incarnate? If we once, yeah, it's a good question. That's one of the big ones. So, yeah, nurture it, carry it, polish it up. On that note, I am going to take a quick break and fill up my coffee, and then we're going to get back into the Phaedo and nail down some more of these arguments. Thanks for joining me in the chat. Thanks for the good question. Thanks for the good sharing too. Sharing not only the logos, but the pathologos. Be right back. Okay, so this is Cebes. Let's see what Socrates says to his friend Cebes, having delivered such a cool little dialectic on learning. And certainly, O Socrates, such is also the case indeed. So we're going to reread it with a background understanding of the dialectic already with us to see if that affects our seeing differently the second time, which is fun to do. Right, which is the dialectic. You go through the dialectic to relate back to the subject to see if, having gone through that process, you see this, you can view the subject in a new way. So the last term of the dialectic, other back to self, which might lead into your question, gave Dub. I keep thinking Grubhub, but also Grave Hub. Grubhub is like some food delivery thing, and Grave Hub would be if you send it to a cemetery or from a cemetery. Ooh. Why, if we have the logos, or if there's some aspect of us that is well, this is the interesting thing. This is also the first hypothesis. At the end of the first hypothesis on the oneself, it says you cannot have a logos of the oneself. So in our series, which I think is in the process of being uploaded to YouTube now, so it should be up by the time people see this on YouTube. There is an interesting conclusion at the end of the first hypothesis on the oneself. You can't have a logos of it, you can't know it, and you can't name it. Either you can't attribute those things to it in being, or so this is the being in the process. You can't know it, nor can you attribute knowledge to it. So right now we're looking at death and dying, being dead and the process. These are two essential things. Thing and the activity. Being alive and coming to be alive, or reincarnating. Dead and the act of dying. And because Socrates said philosophy is the art and practice of death and dying. So, if therefore the oneself doesn't have a logos, but you can have a logos of the first hypothesis, maybe there's something inherent in the first hypothesis that requires you to master the dialectic and come back to the first hypothesis of Parmenides to see it in a new way with your understanding of the dialectic, so that you can recognize there is a logos that you might not have recognized inherently. And then when you come back to the start, when you revert back on the first cause, when you complete your journey home to the oneself, maybe you will see the self in a new way? Question mark? I don't know. That's just a theory, because the dialectic has that as its last step. Why do I have wisdom written there out of nowhere? Okay, so the dialectic has, oops. If the dialectic is the inherent structure of reality, well, the first thing is self to self. Zoom in a little bit. What can you say about, so I guess we would start here as the one self, and there's some sort of emanation or overflowing to another. And then there's some sort of learning we can have in this physical world. We relate to each other. We have experiences, other to other. But then having gone through this, perfecting this with excellence, which leads us into the game of philosophy. What's the excellence of beauty? What's the excellence of justice? What's the thing itself? Not just particulars, not just examples. What's the excellence of reasoning? The logos. And what's the excellence of using the logos? Dialectic, as we see him using it to benefit his friends. Therefore, other back to self. Having mastered the dialectic, and we return back to ourself at the end of our journey, what's the significance of having gone through that? Is there a significance? Is this necessary? This might be something that's needed to see the necessity of our life and all the ups and downs and the suffering and the pains and the apparent injustices we see when we just see one incarnation. Therefore, if we can see that our soul is going through a process of incarnation, which we're doing right now, not just living and dying, but not just being dead and being alive, but the process of coming to be alive again, reincarnation, the process of dying, then maybe when having that perspective, we can see a greater justice. And all the apparent injustices that we suffer through in our physical world can be seen with this greater justice and necessity. And that might be necessary to see beauty in this process of learning. And maybe answering that question that Grave Dub had, why return? If the logos is inherent, why go through this only to return back to where we came? Maybe seeing the necessity and the justice and the beauty of that requires answering that question. I don't know, but what's interesting about that question, it adds more stakes. So what are we doing? We are pushing the implications of the question. So what are we doing? So we've got a question, so let's apply it here. Self to self. You've got a question. What's the question? We just talked about it. How does this question relate to you? We share the question. We push the implications of the question, other to other. So what's the significance of seeing beauty? What's the significance of seeing justice? What's the significance of seeing incarnations to answer the question? These are all the divisions. This is the division set. Definition, demonstration, how it functions to another. Division into all its parts and elements. But what does that do? What does that division do? By sharing that question, talking about how it influences you, sharing that question here, talking about how it influences you, pushing the implications and the relating it to other questions. So if this is one question, these are other questions. You develop stakes. Which adds to the significance of the question, adds to the motivation, the inspiration, helps you move, helps you overcome a lot of fears and doubts that might block you from pursuing your highest goals, pushing the implications of your question. Being motivated by this single question can alleviate a lot of fears, a lot of doubts, a lot of other things, a lot of other desires. So having this question and having the stakes, seeing how important it is, how it relates to all other things, that we are finding significant in philosophy, can help you develop the virtues. Courage. You see this as something worth doing, that you're not going to be motivated by your fears of other things. Or what's the other virtue we talked about in this? Temperance. You're not mastering your pleasures just so you can have vice, so you can do one pleasure good. You're mastering your pleasures so you can be pursuing this question. Why? You see the stakes of it. You see, you're connecting it to other questions. You're building a mind map of all of your questions in philosophy. So this is one of the significant things of bringing in your questions. Hey, we're talking about the soul. Bring in this question about the logos. Why the logos if we're to return? How does it relate? Sharing your questions with others. So this is the significance of this element of relating to ourselves and sharing our questions. And of course, we have the question, well, after having lived that way, sharing our questions, seeing the stakes, related to other questions, shared my understanding and insights and questions with other friends on the journey. What's the significance of having done that in stage 4, in my return back to myself? At the end of the journey, what did this make a difference? Why is that significant? Well, we just said that Parmenides is saying, Socrates, not only you master this yourself, but even greater admiration is given to someone who helps others along the way. So hopefully I haven't answered your question at all. I've just give you more parts to it, made some more stakes, made some more curiosity, made some more elements to it. Okay, so now we're on that note, let's add some more stakes and questions into us here. So, Cebes' argument. So, and in that sort of sense, so too, we're going back after having this discussion with our friends, after applying a dialectic to this argument, seen it in this new way. We are returning back to it to see if the logos and the dialectic on this thing here is significant to our return. So here we are returning it. So we're doing a microcosm of this big question that Gravedub mentioned. Is there a significance of having gone through the dialectic on rereading it? We're going back to where we started. Let's see.
Wow.
Okay. So Socrates finishes his thing by saying, therefore, the cyclical process of returning back to life exists, and the living come to be from the dead, and the souls of the dead do exist. Those were his 3 arguments from Enderman, the straight line, and the fossil fuel argument. If we use fossil fuels to make souls, we would run out of resources. Therefore, the dead has to exist, so it comes from there. If it was a straight line, we'd all end up asleep. We'd all end up dead like Enderman. So it has to be a cyclical process. And all right, and the coming to be. We recognize wait, what was the other one? Enderman, resources. Oh yes, and we can see the coming to be dead or dying, but if the realm of becoming is opposites to its opposites, heavy becomes light, or greater becomes lesser, and the lesser becomes greater. If it's a back and forth of opposites, then we can infer that coming to be alive must exist in nature as well as coming to be dead. Even though we can see the coming to dying part, we can infer the other one. Because what's our argument? Because nature would be lame. It would lack a power. It can do it for everything, but it can't do it for dead and alive. So that would be the implications that follow if it doesn't happen, if we only have a dying. Therefore, if we don't say nature is lame, then there's also a coming to be alive. So the living come to be from the dead. The souls have to exist for there to be resources. Otherwise, we'd run out of resources for souls. So therefore, it has to be from the non-physical, because capitalism, you can't sustain infinite production. Wake up, capitalists. But also as a cyclical process, because if it's a straight line, we'd all end up dead or asleep like Enderman. Okay, those are the 3 arguments we've got so far. And then Cebes chimes in, certainly Socrates, and such is the case indeed, if the doctrine is true that you are accustomed to saying often. He hangs out with him a lot. That learning happens to be for us nothing other than recollection. Definition. And according to this, we have necessarily learned, according to this, follows, we have necessarily learned at some previous time that which we now recollect. But, pushed in the implications, division, that would be impossible if our soul were not somewhere before she came to exist in this human form. Conclusion, so that according to this doctrine, the soul is likely to be something that is immortal. Okay, thank you, Cebes. What do we say? And what does Owen say? No.
Wow.
Wow. Yes, Owen. Well, Simmias interrupted his friend Cebes and said, but what proofs that you can show of these things, O Cebes? Remind me, for I do not quite recall them at this time. Okay, on the one hand, there is one excellent logos that when humans are being questioned, if they are questioned in a good way and answer out of selves about everything which they possess, and yet this could not be made possible if they did not happen to innately know knowledge and right logos. These are two big ones, knowledge and logos. Then if you take up a diagram like in the Meno, which we did here, this diagram, and you ask people questions about it, it will be seen most clearly that it has to be in this way. Okay, so what's another way the dialectic unfolds? With our friends, with our conversations. So, our thing about Cebes' learning, we can see also. Oops. Also, we could see that this whole dialectic that we just outlined could itself be seen as its own kind of definition within the context of the argument, within the context of the discussion or the conversation, let's say, is a definition. Therefore, what happens? It gets asked as a question, and then our friend gives an answer, and our friend Simmias says either he is yes or no. And then we have to judge. And we judge. We judge the answer. How do we judge it? Is it sufficient? If not, then give a demonstration. So we can see within his definition was the DDAS or the SOs, but also within the greater context of the conversation, it's used according to the dialectic too. Why? Because he said, hey, look, this is my definition. If learning exists, then we had to have learned it from somewhere. Therefore, our soul has to be immortal. It's like, it's pretty succinct. But here's the thing: if it was sufficient, if the definition was sufficient, so our answer, that's, let's say, Cebes. Oh, sorry. I might. Oh. Welcome. Could the logic of the dialect be recreated in Minecraft Redstone? I don't know. I'm not familiar with Minecraft. I might have to physically create it. Would make sense to me. Yeah, sure. Can you explain this in Redstone, please? Might help. What is Redstone? I'll try. What's Redstone? So let's, while you outline what Redstone is in chat. I haven't played Minecraft in such a long time. So then, so this is Cebes's question. He didn't phrase it as a question, but if he was aware that he was actually talking to his friend, he could have put it into a question. And then, number 2, we have Simmias's answer, which is either a yes or no. Yes, that definition was sufficient for me to follow. Yeah. Okay, I heard your argument from recollection that if everything we learn, our soul is recollecting, like we learn what beauty is, we learn what justice is, but you've never seen a beautiful thing. Therefore, wherever you learn beauty or justice must be in a non-physical world. Therefore, our soul had to have existed somewhere else before it came into this world where it learned it. And if that somewhere else is not physical, then it must necessarily be the afterlife or the dead world. So Simmias' answer has to judge whether or not the definition was sufficient. And then Cebes must judge that answer. So there's judgments that happen. Judge whether the definition was sufficient. And then Cebes must judge that answer. If not, sufficient. If not, on to the next stage, which is demonstration. Redstones are the wires that make the computers. I remember there. It's a logic kind of thing. On-off switches, I think. Yeah. You can recreate a working... Wow. Turing complete. All computers are Turing complete. Computer is in a computer as a logic follows. Think of a virtual PC. It follows logic, so people use it to make on-off switches. They can use it to make Game Boys. What? Playing Windows on Linux. Wow. What is the simplest dialect you can do? Like make the letters bigger? Like what Socrates said about the soul? Is it small? Alan Turing. Right. Yeah. I reckon you can make a Turing thing. Well, I mean, you could do it. Okay, let's try it. What's something you're interested in? Let's say bikes. Number one, definition. Or self itself. What can you say about the bike in relation to itself? That means in relation to. It's got wheels, it's got a handlebar, and so on. But if you were explaining a bike to someone who's never seen a bike before, you're not really giving a full explanation of it. You might also want to talk about how it demonstrates or functions. Demonstration. How does that bike that you've just defined there, self to itself, self in relation to itself, but just the bike itself, not in relation to anything else, just in relation to itself. That's S to S, self in relation to itself. Then this self that you've just defined becomes so it rolls on. It has this rolling on, your logic rolls on. So you've just defined it. So using that definition, you then talk about how it demonstrates itself. You use a bike to go to a shop. Right. Yes. Demonstration of function. So now you've got SO, an other. So now you pick another. You can pick any other. In fact, you can make like if you wanted to do several dialectics, you could pick different others. So how the bike relates to you. Probably you're going to say you because you have a bike, but you could say how a bike relates into your transport, or how a bike functions in relation to getting to work. But let's pick a simple one. How does it relate to you as the bike owner? I use the bike to get to the store in a shorter time than it takes me to walk. I use the bike to get to places. Right, and then the next thing is division. So you having that bike, so again, it rolls on. So this one becomes the topic of the next one. So what you learn from one level, you take back and you start again. So the next level, this is the first O, other, to another other, other others. So having been affected by the bike in the way that you've just described, how do you relate to other others? Whoops. So then you can say, well, being a bike owner myself, I'm allowed to go to BMX events. I'm able to double my friends to the store. I'm able to make impress girls and make a girlfriend. That's stupid. I'm allowed to. I'm able to do awesome BMX tricks and wheelies as I bike down the street and impress girls and go on dates. This is how I, having been defined here, relate to others. So if you're explaining a bike to someone, you don't want to just talk about what it is and how it uses, but what you can use it for. We talked about the stakes before, the stakes of it. And then finally, you have to also talk about, well, how do you, after having gone through all that, relate back to the bike itself? You might say, well, I've got to make sure that's called synthesis analysis. So you synthesize everything and then you take it back to the front and analyze the subject. You see the subject in the new way. So you want to care for your bike. You want to make sure the tires are pumped up. You want to grease the chains. So if you leave any of this out, you're not really explaining what a bike is to someone who's never heard of it. You have to tell them about how you have to care for the bike. Or if it's a car, how you have to put petrol in the car and so on. Synthesis, yeah. Train station logic. What's that? So this is a dialectic. Now, a bike is just a simple analogy. We want to take it anagogically. We want to, you can make it about a city, or you can even higher and talk about the ideas. I want to understand beauty itself. So applying it to the self ideas, the aspects of the brilliant light of being itself, of truth, the truth of reality, which has aspects to it that we learn through reading Plato. That's why we're reading Plato. He's giving us information through the logos about beauty itself and justice itself, and like the Republic's about justice. And so we learn about it, but we have to make it our own. So we put it into our own dialectic. So we have documents in our favorite note folder that we develop our own dialectic. So we talk about, okay, what have I learned about beauty itself? That's the first category. And now the dialectic means two, dia. So what can I pick as another idea, another stick to rub against that stick to better understand the topic? So I pick another. So I might be also learning about justice. So S is beauty and O is justice. So I pick my terms, beauty and O is justice. Before it was S is the bike and O is me. Now O is justice, because now we're doing philosophy. So how does beauty relate to justice? Which allows you to learn more about beauty and justice by saying, oh, by the way, beauty, everything is perfectly ordered the way it should be, which therefore it's necessary for justice. And you wouldn't be able to see the beauty of your life unless you saw there was a justice to even your problems, and so on. So this often is the realm of being, because beauty and justice are both self-er terms, so they're aspects of the realm of being. And that's what we've been learning. That philosophy is, let's get the quote from, this is a quote from our text. While we live, we shall be closest to knowing when we neither associate nor commune with the body more than is necessary. We must purify ourselves from it until the divine self should liberate us. Thus, being purified, having been liberated from the phronesis of the body, we shall be likely to be with such a kind. Okay, that's not really the quote I want. Okay, I'm going to make more quotes. I'll do that after the stream. Let's go back to this. So what can you say about beauty in relation to justice? Now, what can you say about justice having been affected by beauty in relation to other ideas? Or, if you want to go from the realm of being down to the realm of becoming, how does it relate to us as a philosopher? So you can pick what your other is going to be. So justice, now that it has beauty, how does it function to us in our world? Or how does it function to the other ideas? And then finally, you pick one of those. How does justice, this one here, or us, having been affected by beauty in this way, how do we relate back to beauty? Or maybe we study it. But then that's not enough. You have to do the exact same thing, but if beauty doesn't exist. That's if it is and if it isn't. A and B. So you have to do a what if world for B. What would be the world if beauty doesn't exist? Division of a letter. It is self-contained unit of. Oh, you want to do a dialectic on letters? Interesting, yeah. Right. So division, they say, what can you say about letters themselves? Pick an O, pick something that you are interested in or you think would most highlight something about letters. And then that thing, how does it relate to other things? And then from this stage of division, pick a key term. It could be, so what was it? Letters in relation to what? Alphabet. Okay. So how do letters relate to the alphabet? And then how does the alphabet relate to books, knowledge, Yep, a whole list of things. Now, of those things in here, pick a key idea that really stands out for you. How does that relate back to letters? Having been affected by letters in that way, how does that thing then relate back to the subject? So with beauty, so let's go back to beauty. What would be if it didn't exist? Letters is a tricky one, by the way. If beauty does not exist, if beauty is only in the eye of the beholder, what can you say about it? Opinion, taste, illusion. And then how does beauty relate to, let's say, I don't know, justice? Let's say justice again. There's no beauty in justice. Justice is ugly. Then how does justice relate to us? We don't seek justice anymore because there's no beauty in it, and humans are motivated by beauty. Therefore, we do not seek justice. We allow injustice. And therefore, how do we, allowing injustice, relate back to beauty? Indifferent. We relate to it through, we mock it. So this would be the kind of universe that exists if beauty didn't exist. And so we're doing that with the soul. We're doing a dialectic on the soul. What would happen if the soul exists? And Simmias. And Simmias just did one on, was it Simmias or Cebes? Cebes just did one on learning. So what can you say about learning itself? It's recollection. How does recollection relate? How does this learning relate to our soul? Well, if we recall, if our soul learns through recollection in our everyday world, then the soul must have had it in the previous life. So he must have learnt it prior. So learnt, how does learning relate to the soul? The soul learnt, there's our learning, there's our soul, prior to life. Okay, so now how does that soul as our other relate to humans? Well, if we learnt prior, then we must have learnt prior to our human existence. So while we were dead, learnt before human life. Then, if from that division, what's a key term that sticks out to you? Well, what's the most important term from that? Well, we learnt before our human life, therefore our soul is immortal. Therefore, how do immortality? So how does that key idea that surfaces help us better understand the subject? Either S or O, either learning or the soul. The soul is immortal. Very, very simple dialectic, very succinct, very efficient, very cool. So you could say, because it's so succinct and such a efficient definition of a dialectic, how does it function in the conversation? Well, let's see. Context of conversation. It is a definition. Now, Cebes could have asked it as a question. Hey, is this sufficient? To whoever he's talking to. They're all in a conversation, so he didn't pick anyone else, didn't have to. Simmias jumps in and he has to give an answer. So here we have our question and answer. Question and answer. I wish I had a highlighter on this. Question and answer. Simmias has to judge whether the definition was sufficient. Again, sufficient. And then Cebes must judge that answer, because he might say, yeah, no, yeah, I get it. Yeah, oh, yeah, the soul is immortal. Yeah, because of learning. Sure. Right on. But then Cebes, in the human interaction, this is a dialectic playing out in conversation. Cebes has to judge that answer. Was it really a sufficient answer? Or was he just kind of trying to be polite or trying to not be embarrassed? If not, if it was like, no, I don't get it, or I don't really trust you saying that you follow, we have to go from definition to demonstration. So there's our, in terms of the dialectic, stage 1 to stage 2. Give a demonstration. You've just defined it. That wasn't sufficient. It's like, oh, yeah. No, okay. Let me give a demonstration of what I've just defined. In the chat, you recognize this is what you're doing when you're reasoning through with someone in a conversation about the merits of veganism. You've been doing a dialectic on people out in the wild. Yes, this is dialectic on people in the wild. Cool. I'm glad that you noticed it. So, give a demonstration of it. Let's see if he does. That's where we're up to. Simmias interrupted. But what are the proofs that you can show of these things, O Cebes? So, his answer was not sufficient. Remind me, because I don't quite recall them at the time. And now he's making a hilarious joke because he doesn't remember. So his definition that all learning is recollection, what we previously learned, we have within us. So what we do in our world with our friends out in the wild is serves the purpose to remind us. And he says, it didn't quite work yet. I do not quite recall. So he's kind of playing along. So go give a demonstration. Let's see if he does. So again, we're judging not just Cebes' use of the dialectic in his first argument, but can he use it in real time? On the one hand, there is one excellent logos. Oh, cool. That when humans are being questioned, if they are questioned in a good way, is our question, and they answer out of selves, there's our answer. They've just been pointing to. Dialectic involves out in the wild, as we've been saying, about everything which they possess. Okay, if they're questioned in a good way, so there's a certain mastership or skill, art to the questioning, then they answer out of themselves about everything which they possess. So everything you've learned about beauty or the soul, everything you've learned about the soul by this read along of the Phaedo, I'm going to draw out of you in a conversation. But this could not be possible. Oh, but by the way, he's saying not just in this dialogue, but I can ask you, if our questions are asked in a good way, it will bring to surface that which you didn't even know that you know. This could not be possible if selves did not happen to innately know knowledge and the right logos. So if the doctrine of Socrates is correct, that it's through the dialectic, it's through the logos that we attain noesis, apprehension of knowledge, then what we're apprehending we once knew. And that means that through this question and answer, you're drawing it out of yourself or your friends. Then if you take up a diagram like we did with Pythagoras, or anything of this kind, it will be seen most clearly that it has to be in this way. So what's a good demonstration of this idea? The dialectic. Asking good questions and you answer it, and then you must have the knowledge and right logos. Then Socrates jumps in and says, on the other hand, if indeed this does not persuade you, O Simmias, consider whether the following would be agreeable to you. For having examined it in such a way, then, in what way would you distrust what we say, that learning is recollection? Okay, so how well did Cebes do? Did he give a good demonstration, or did he point to someone else who can give a good demonstration? Well, one excellent logos is that when humans are engaged in the dialectic, they seem to be able to innately know knowledge and right opinion. And if you make a diagram like Socrates did in the Meno, then you could show it. So what happened? Oh, the dialectic that Socrates does shows it. Oh, and if you did a diagram like Socrates did, you could show it. But he wasn't able to demonstrate it. So while he has come a certain degree, so we can judge how well is Cebes able to not just create his own dialectic, but use it in conversation. Maybe not so great. So Socrates jumped in and said, hang on a second, I'll jump in now. Tag me in. And he says, in what way do you distrust what we say? So we can say he's being a bit more precise. Is the Socratic method a dialectic? Yeah, it seems to be, hey. And so we're seeing Socrates in action. The Socratic way, absolutely. So Socrates is saying, okay, you want more of a demonstration. First, I'm going to ask you, where are you stuck? Where are you falling down? So he's relating to the person. What's your problem? How am I going to direct my dialectic to you specifically? Important, right? If you're a doctor and you want to benefit someone with your art, you say, hey, what's your problem? Simmias, on the one hand, I do not indeed distrust either of you, whereas on the other hand, I stand in need of this self to learn of that of which the logos is about, recollection. He needs to learn about the idea of recollection. So it sounds like Simmias is not as familiar with Socrates' work as Cebes is. I need to learn about the logos of recollection. What's the significance of that? Humans are cool. Jed is a human. Jed is cool. If Jed wasn't, then he wouldn't be cool. Very good use of the dialectic. I think the most important use of the dialectic I've ever heard. So Socrates is like using more of a skill, more of an art. I'm going to direct, what is it that you're having trouble with? The logos of recollection. And from that which Cebes attempts to describe, I am already remembering that I'm nearly persuaded. Nevertheless, to not sufficient, right? I would now like to hear the way you were attempting to describe it. In this way, to me at least, for without a doubt we agree that if anyone recollects anything, then self must have already known it at some time beforehand. So now he's dividing up the arguments. He said, hey, look, this is your problem. And from our work in the Parmenides, we saw Parmenides asking Socrates, hey, what's your problem, son? And that directed his use of the dialectic. So we can see a certain amount of mastery and artful use of it. So, right, if we recollect, we must have known it beforehand. Yes. So he's asking it to Simmias. So question and answer, by all means. Take notice then, do we also agree on the following, that when knowledge presents herself in a way like this, when knowledge presents herself in a way like this, then she is recollection. But in what way do I mean this? In this way, for if anyone either sees or hears or perceives, seeing, hearing, and perceiving. Call back to Xenophanes' question. So Socrates learnt this originally from Parmenides. And Parmenides had a teacher named Xenophanes. Last time we talked about what we knew of Xenophanes. Here we go. Our intellectual and spiritual tradition, our golden age, our birthright. What is it? The lineage from Xenophanes. Xenophanes taught Parmenides, Parmenides taught Socrates, and here we see Socrates teaching Simmias and Cebes. If A equals B, A plus B equals C, and A, B, C. A is to B, yes. So this is, we see this here. A is to B, so Xenophanes is to Parmenides, as B is to C, as Parmenides is to Socrates. That's a mean analogy. And now as Parmenides is to Socrates, we are seeing as Socrates is to Simmias and Cebes. So Xenophanes, we know from Xenophanes, it is the whole that sees and hears. And then people heard that and they turned it into a question so we can be an object of our contemplation. We want to make questions as a philosopher. What is the whole that sees and hears? And some people thought, well, maybe it's what is the whole of God? Is that the whole that he meant? Maybe it's the whole of mind. So make that the question. What is the whole of mind that sees and hears? And someone came along and said, well, hang on a second. What about thinking? What is the whole of mind that sees, hears, and thinks? Then someone said, well, I can make it more immediate because whatever is this whole is happening right now in the present. I can separate from the distractions even more when I say, what is the whole that sees, hears, and thinks right now? And someone said, what about the whole self? Is that what's seeing, hearing, and thinking? And then someone took it this way. What is the whole of seeing, hearing, and thinking right now? And what is watching right now? What is the whole of seeing, hearing, and thinking right now? And what is the one self that's watching? Adding in the Parmenides. So we see a evolution and a refinement of Xenophanes' original question. What is the whole of seeing, hearing, and thinking right now? Makes it immediate. And also in our doctrine of the Phaedo, we want to separate from the particulars of our senses and see the whole of it. What is awareness itself? Before you distinguish background and foreground, before you pull something out with your eyes and ears, can you hear sound as a whole? Can you see vision as a whole? And can you apply it to thought? Tick all the boxes of perception. The thoughts that bubble up, can you view even those as a whole? Right now. And maybe adding to your wonder, what is the one self watching? Or what is the self that's watching? Or just simply what is watching? Make it your own. That's the Xenophanes koan, or not koan. Question, mantra, puzzle. Hold it for as long as you can whenever you're doing anything, when you're washing dishes, when you're anything you're doing. Can you hold on to it and see what happens and share your feedback? I held on to it for a month. This is what happened to me. Ah, cool. Sharing in the chat similar exercises to perceive the whole. So, what is the whole of seeing, hearing, and thinking right now? Why are we talking about that? Well, if that's what we get from Xenophanes, who taught Parmenides, here we see Socrates using it. For if anyone sees, hears, or perceives, there's our seeing, hearing, and thinking. Of course, perceiving isn't, we're including thinking with that. If anyone sees, hears, or perceives anything in another way, then they recognize it by grasping not only that, but also another entity they have in mind, the knowledge of which is not the same but different. Accordingly then, are we not justly declaring they recollect that which they grasp present to their mind? Okay, so he started off with the idea of recollection. So that's a definition. Then he gives a demonstration, a simple demonstration of that definition. Hey, when you recognize it, not only do you grasp the thing, but something different as well, right? Is that sufficient? Are you with me? Do you see it already? Simmias says no. In what way do you mean? Okay, the definition to division, definition of his argument, demonstration in a simple way. Simmias says, no, I ain't following. So what happens? Division. So now we see him dividing it up into its arguments. So this is Socrates demonstrating to his friend Cebes how he should have responded. Cebes gave a fantastic little refined dialectic on showing that our soul must necessarily be immortal based on the idea of learning through recollection. Simmias wasn't familiar with that doctrine, and so he said, I don't follow. Which means Cebes should have asked him, okay, where are you stuck? Okay, now that I know where you're stuck, I can use the dialectic to you as a human being. I'm going to start with the definition. Then I'm going to give it a little demonstration. If that's not sufficient, I'm going to have to go into division. I kind of know that the definition isn't going to be sufficient because you just said I don't quite know. But he's demonstrating this to Cebes. This is what you could have done. What you should do. What we should do. Okay? So, now he's going to divide it up. Socrates is going to divide up the theory of recollection to show that the soul must be immortal, which is what we want, because we want to recognize our soul as immortal. And we also want to learn and know what the heck's involved. And get there. And also when we get there, keep doing it. And when we're hanging out with friends, use it. Do it at all times, whatever we do, privately and publicly. That sounds like justice, the virtue of justice. Doing it with our own direct experience sounds like the upgrade from the virtue of wisdom to self-renaissance. That was the initiation into the experience of the immortal soul in the realm of being. Recognizing for ourselves what we developed through our dialectic and our understanding through arguments, through the logos. Verifying it for ourselves. That's the mystical initiation Socrates referred to, probably. Again, theories, ifs. Take all of these things I'm saying as ifs. Make them your own. Take them as ifs. They either work or they don't. Okay? So, in what way do you not only grasp the same but different? So we can recognize the use of his logos from Parmenides, same and different. In this way, knowledge of a human and that of a liar is different, right? Okay, so he's asking every step, he's bringing him along. It's cooperative. That's the difference between debate and dialectic. It's not a big speech where you prove you're right and your opponent sucks and they should be doxed or whatever. The opposite. Are you with me? Let's go together. It's cooperative, the exact opposite of war and discord. Not hate. It's the ideal of love, ideal of care, ideal of benefit. In the chat, I know it is a hidden religion because by the time we get to me understanding you, it's gibberish to others. Well, that's why we want to use it in this way. This thing about recollection as learning as recollection is kind of gibberish to Simmias. And Socrates goes, okay, what part are you having problem with? Well, actually, I haven't learned this logos about recollection. All right, let's start together. By the way, definition. If you recollect anything, you must have already known it, right? Sure. And, okay, so I think this is the division because it's starting step one. Sure. So question and answer, bringing you along, making it clear. And when you get knowledge of something that you're recollecting, for anything you see, hear, or perceive, you grasp not only that, but another entity that's different. Accordingly, then, we can justice. He's using justice. So these ideas that he talked about earlier in his doctrine, justice and beauty, He's using it in his functioning. He's functioning with it. He said, hey, you can only perceive justice in this experience of noesis. And you only get by purifying yourself from the body through the activity of dianoia, which we call the dialectic. Now he's using it. It's not. We are justly declaring that when you recollect something, you are grasping not only that, but it's what's different. Right? In the chat, I tried to explain what a Platonist is and why I am one. Right, it gets hidden by using the dialectic to hide what you are doing at first, standing in the threshold. How did you okay. How did you explain what a Platonist is and why you are one? So, do you get it? He answered no. So now he has to take that simple demonstration and divide it up. He's going to talk about a liar, like a little harpy thing. You can see it on my screen. It's a liar. It was hard, yeah, and they didn't get it. Oh well. You can always try again. That's the thing about the dialect. You can keep going back. You're supposed to repeat it. Keep trying. You're not supposed to be perfect right away. You are in a purification and a perfecting process. It's a dialogue. It's a conversation. That's our lifetime. Our life is an entire conversation. Whether you like it or not, you are either conversing with the self-logos or the pathologos. Whether you like it or not, you have thoughts that bubble up. And you can relate to them. You can be angry at them. You can believe them and think that you're a this or a that. Or you can, as Socrates says, treat them like a friend. In other words, if your friend said, hey, you suck, you wouldn't go, oh, okay, I guess I suck. You'd say, hang on, why are you saying that, Tim? Oh, you shouldn't dance. You suck at dancing. Hang on, Tim, why would you say that? That's not a friendly thing to say, Tim. What's going on? Where did that come from? Or maybe if you are saying it, can you say it in a nicer way that I can learn how to dance better? That's how you treat your friend. We're going to learn how to do that to our own minds. These thoughts that come up that tell us we're inadequate or we're going to fail or everything negative, we have to relate to it as a friend, which is, how is Socrates relating to his friends? The dialectic. Not only that, we have a... Tim, you bush pig. We also have a quieter voice that whispers or talks to us about the logos. Part of attuning ourselves is attuning to that voice, the voice of the daemon, which is why Socrates is imprisoned, by the way. He went, oh yeah, there's a voice of the daemon that I listen to that communicates the divine to me in all possible ways. And with our friends, we can share in either. Do we want to gossip and put people down, or do we want to engage in the self-logos with our friends? Practice the dialectic, as Simmias and Cebes and Socrates is doing, and is even in his last day. Life is a conversation. Life is a dialectic, whether we like it or not, with one of these two, the false self or the true self. Or creating a mythology in the middle that represents the principles of either. Right, to be as like a daemon. So, that's why we're going through this. That's why we're sharing our ideas with each other. That's why we're sharing our experiences. That's why we're taking time to nail down these arguments. Because we're in the game anyway. We are all philosophers.
You're a wizard, Harry.
The difference is, are we engaging in a dialectic that goes through that process of self to self? Let's give a different color. Self to self, self to others, others to others, then others back to self in a way that confirms, maintains, protects, purifies the false idea of the self that functions to us in a negative way, that plays out in our life in a negative way, that causes us to understand ourselves in a negative way? Or are we going through that dialectic with the true self? Understanding the ideas, how they relate to each other, the significance, and how we can best understand ourself, our soul, the truth, the phronesis. Whether we like it or not, we are going through this at every moment, either with the voice of the false self or the voice of the true self, the pathologos or the daemon. So we are going through this together in the Phaedo to learn the mastery of how to do both. How do we relate to something in ignorance, like our false voice, the voice of our usually parents, our upbringing, our culture, our bad mythology? The same way as Socrates is relating to the ignorance of Simmias right now. How do we relate to that? But also, how do we relate to the true self? How did Socrates give his doctrine of philosophy? What did Socrates go through to actually experience that, such that he has that self-phronesis and can use it for both Simmias and Cebes, for both what's good and bad? So we're in this game whether we like it or not. Do you want to do it well? Do you want to remove the voice that drags you along to your chains you and drags you along to the suffering and the inevitable failures of fate? Or do you want to be able to answer it in a good way? Purify yourself. And do you want to be drawn up to your highest, most significant states of mind's understanding and self-goals? You have an opportunity to. In fact, Socrates says that's specifically what we're here to do. That's why we're taking our time. That's why we're going over it. That's why we're including our friends, giving our own current understanding, relating it to our own lives, nailing it down. So we're in this game whether we like it or not. The question is whether we want to play the game well. That's why they say philosophy is not only the noblest game, it's really the only game in town. On that note, thank you for joining me. I hope to see you next time, where we're going to jump back into the text and see how Socrates does that. How does he relate to someone who doesn't know this yet? How does he relate to someone who has his own mythology that doesn't understand the soul in this way? How does Socrates use this dialectic to relate to the negative? The same way we saw how Cebes used the dialectic to tell the truth. Yes, thank you, chat. Much fun. Thank you for joining me, chat. Appreciate you being here. We'll be able to find these on YouTube. I hope you enjoy them on YouTube. Leave your comments in the chat. Subscribe, like, and all that. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time.